Um, okay, so Tim, it looks like we have Cora from what I'm seeing here. With 5 on the line and then um, folks in the room. So Lori, we can pick it up.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you for being here. For the folks who are on the screen, particularly when we're showing slides, please recognize that you're very small boxes that you are speaking out of, and some of us may or may not be able to distinguish seeing a hand or getting your name right because we can't see you very well. So please be indulgent and speak up. So, I can tell Laura is there, but she'll have to say, "It's Laura." Thank you for doing this in that way. Some of this is going to be a tag team between Jen and myself, but I did just want to flag a couple things before we go into the roll call. And Jen, you are going to highlight just a couple things here on the public call input and a changed role for one of our expert advisory committee members. And then we'll go into that and the brief overview of the agenda. So why don't, Jen, I call on you to issue the public call.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for joining us in person and on the line. Really appreciate this, and thanks for braving the journey to warm Sacramento. So as I think I may have mentioned in an email to many of you, but we're obviously really relying on this committee and all of your efforts to help us determine this range of ambitious targets by January 2024. So again, just appreciate so much of the thinking that you all are doing at these meetings, but I also know in between the meetings. In addition to that, we are starting a process of communicating a lot with our state partners within our state family about, what are some of the targets that you're hoping to see? How do we build on the great work of the scoping plan and other efforts? So we have sort of that other pathway to generate ideas of working with our state colleagues. But we now have a third pathway where we have put out a public call for input on our website, just making sure that we are being really transparent and open and soliciting, ideas across the state for what these targets could look like. So on our site, we have a call for any ideas and suggestions and recommendations to inform this range of targets. So that will be sort of a third pathway that we're going to be collecting input from the state. And that public call for input is open through mid-September. I'll share the link again for all of the committee members here and folks in the room. But please also share with your networks and communities as we kind of go through this process, and just know that we're so grateful for everything you all are doing, and also looking to make sure we engage other Californians and other people steeped in these issues while also talking with ourselves internally about this range of targets. So that's really my update. Happy to answer any questions about that, or look to my colleagues to add in any other details. I just wanted to make sure you all were aware of that, and you helped sort of get the word out and amplify as appropriate.
Questions? Marion, would you like to share with folks the new role that you're undertaking?
Sure. So my former affiliation was with the UC Santa Barbara Natural Reserve System, and I am moving on from my position there. So my affiliation with this committee will no longer be associated with UC. I will be working with the Moore Foundation starting next month, but I'm not representing the Moore Foundation here in the So rather than an institutional affiliation, I'll just use my my credentials essentially. That's my identifier, if you will, which will be my name and then environmental science, PhD in environmental science management.
And can everybody on the line in the ether hear everybody speaking? Could you do a thumbs up? Okay,
Okay,
great.
you can hear that.
Thanks.
Is there a microphone that I should generally
I
speak towards? Oh, the feet over there. Okay, sorry about that.
No.
And last thing is just that my email address will now change. Well, so previously I had a UCSB email address and moved to a Gmail address, and I believe it's been floated around. Or the contact list has been updated. Is that right?
Yes.
Great. So we're all.
Okay, well, why don't we do our formal roll call? So, some of you are on the line. Christy, I'm just going to go alphabetically. Christy Brigham,
Present.
John,
Present.
Chelsea. Chelsea will be joining us later, we hope by phone. Nathaniel. Matt,
Present.
William,
Present.
Laura,
Present.
Got a car and traveled to Phoenix, Arizona.
does anybody else will be able to join us later?
You probably won't be joining us.
Okay. Debbie. Mark? Mark still in Campbell? Okay.
Yeah.
Gary. Melissa,
I'm here.
I'm theoretically here. And Mario. If we could quickly go to a brief agenda overview, we're very pleased and gratified that we have two guest speakers with us in the later part of this meeting, Sylvia Troost, and then three people from the Carbon Cycle Institute, Jeff and Jonathan. Sylvia may be joined by a couple of others from the Pew Trust, but she will be the lead on that. So each of them will have roughly 45 minutes on the agenda. And Sylvia will come first because she's on East Coast time, I believe. And we're going to let her off the hook sooner than later for that. As we walk through our reports from our different focal groups, ad hoc informal working groups by focal group, we will have presentation from those subgroups, committee discussion, and then at the end, we'll open it for public comment at that point. So I'm not sure. Oh, we're very close to being on time. We're just 2 minutes behind that. So that's our agenda. And for the day, we will have a break. If people really need a break prior to 2 hours from now, we'll figure it out at the present. So with that, why don't we go to reports out from our subgroups with everybody here. I am going to kick off the forest subgroup simply because I was on it. But pretty much everybody from the subgroup is going to contribute to that. We had time for a couple of meetings between our last expert advisory committee meeting and right now. So we've had a chance to develop some focused areas of recommendation in looking at forests. And we're looking at forests as conifer, oak woodlands, but also riparian. And we're looking not only at the types, but at both the knitting together of action in the short term and in the long term to help achieve state objectives with that. In the course of that, we started to surface some cross-cutting themes that we also want to bring to folks' attention with that, because every group will no doubt have some of those either same ideas or have other cross-cutting themes that they want to present. And within that, each of us has taken a little bit of a leadership role in specific areas. So I have focused more on the conifer forest. Christy has focused more on direct restoration activities. Marian has been helping us lead on oak and riparian forest types. And Laura is helping us think more broadly about our interactions across the system and in terms of supporting natural system function frankly, as a cross-cutting theme with that. The three cross-cutting themes per se that we have so far identified, one is this focus on, across all of our systems, a recommendation to focus on restoring and enhancing natural system function and working with that suite of species and processes. Another is that we have some natural cross-cutting features, for example, rivers and streams. So some of the riparian work is really cross-cutting across all of these systems and to be looked at. These systems have permeable borders or gradiated borders, and that helps knit across those lines. And the third is that we do very much want to link the short and the long term. So there are lots of kinds of immediate actions that we can make, but we don't want to just be recommending lots of short-term actions. We want to ground that in the long-term endurance of that. And a tool that keeps coming into conversations that I've been part of across several groups is the use of conservation easement on private lands to help drive that kind of long-term continuity of desired outcomes. And Marian will talk about oaks and riparian forests. Laura's going to talk a little bit about natural processes, and cross-cutting. Christie will speak about particular restoration on activities on public lands. In terms of the private forest lands, in terms of conifer forests, looking at the opportunities there, one of the most critical opportunities that we've surfaced is having more carbon, which is in a safer form, across the landscape in our forests, because we know that the opportunity to slightly extend the age of forests in the short term and the long term is going to have huge impact. So we've done some work on that and are making a recommendation that for the 60% of private forests that are owned by corporates, these are the ones that are managed the most heavily and have the most carbon flux and are the youngest in general. And so on average, increasing the age of those forest types has a huge return in the short and long term. And establishing a target of nesting, restoration, and long-term conservation on 40% of that 60% has a really significant near-term carbon yield in the 5 and 10-year range of several hundred million metric tons in this time frame, like in the range of 350 to 425 million metric tons of gain, which can also then help offset some of the emissions associated with more restoration, since one of the key recommendations is to continue and enhance restoration activities for fuels management and promoting climate resilience. So this is a really interesting kind of regionally nested, focused recommendation that we're looking at making for conifer forests. And Chrissy will talk more about the public lands portion, but it is interesting that less than 3% of our conifer forests that are owned privately in the state are actually conserved. And looking at this from the point of view of what I would call active conservation, where you're embedding desired outcome goals in managed forest targeting through working forest conservation easements, so that you know the short term will get those long-term results as well. These are elements that we think are all nested together. So that is one recommendation that we're going to be developing further. It's enormously cost effective, actually, when you look at the return per dollar. And we'll be doing a little bit more work in that regard as we flesh this out. But when we look at the kinds of investments that are being made in other emissions reduction sectors that have, costs starting right now, like in electric vehicles, in the $90 per ton of CO2 equivalent, and these are going to be in the under $5 and under $10 per ton equivalent. So pretty impressive, and then yielding more long-term outcomes as well. So that's on the conifer forest. If I could turn to you, Marian, to talk about oak and riparian, recognizing there is some interplay between these systems, because obviously mixed conifer has oaks in them going to pure and riparian runs through.
Sure, yeah, thank you, Lori, for that summary. It was very good. What I'll deliver today will not be as in-depth as what Lori just presented, mostly because the work to really look into the oak and riparian zones is still ongoing and still we're still looking at it and discussing it as well, including some additional data collection. The Wildlife Conservation Board, as you all know, has a riparian habitat restoration program, which could be a really good source of information for us as to how they prioritize, and even if there's any information that they may have that shows what any carbon sequestration is measured via projects they've already gotten on the ground and running too, since that program has been around for quite a while. So we're still looking around at different data sources like that too, but just a few comments though on riparian habitat in particular. One, I'm still just trying to find, the best, most exact estimate of the acreage of riparian habitats that are out there in California. You know, there's different numbers in different places, and maybe this is the group to come to for that. The published literature and some other things say things. It's just an unknown that we're still unknown, just an unfound yet. But there are lots of co-benefits of riparian habitat restoration, and the literature is very clear that also this kind of restoration or protection has really a lot of bang for the buck in terms of carbon sequestration as well. So this is like I said, there's a lot of good research support out there for it, and obviously there are state programs and federal programs that support that as well. So we're continuing to look through that. And then oaks, I'm kind of separating them a little bit. I'm not quite ready to integrate my thoughts on that, but I think as our subcommittee is working on it, we'll get there. But oaks, I think one thing that's really exciting about oak is just, the huge potential, because the huge biomass of oaks that are out there in California, that can really have a big bang for the buck here, a lot of impact. There's also, I think, something that's really interesting about oaks that's a cross-cutting, and I'm not sure who is on the urban committee. I think that there's a lot of there for oak restoration in the urban cities as well. That also has a lot of co-benefits too. So again, still just working down those two habitat types at this time. Welcome anybody's feedback and input on that as well. And I think I'll stop.
One of the interesting things is this nesting of shorter term with conifers being faster growing and having more yield known about them in that time frame, and the longer term with the broad ecological benefits that we establish in our own forests. Christy, do you want to speak about the oaklands restoration?
Sure. Just to back up a tiny bit. So the two, as Lori said, there's a lot of overlap in conifer forests and maybe different strategies and mechanisms effective on different levers that will be effective for private lands versus public lands. So I just wanted to reiterate what Lori had said about the strategy of conserving existing mature California forest lands. So one of the things I'm working on is the plan currently identifies a target, a fuel reduction target through prescribed fire or thinning or other methods to reduce fuels to conserve carbon, so carbon isn't lost in wildfire. I think the target in the plan right now is 2.3 million acres a year, but that's across grasslands, shrublands, and forests. So trying to look at other documents and have a potentially a hectare or acre target in terms of that strategy, preserving existing carbon stocks through fuel reduction. And that has in the table, we identified a lot of co-benefits in terms of durable carbon storage, mitigating other greenhouse gas emissions because of reduced wildfire emissions, helping with adaptation and ecosystem function and adaptation to climate change, et cetera. So then the other strategy that Lori mentioned is this idea of restoring forest cover in areas where forest has been lost. primarily the largest amount in California to high severity wildfire. And so that's the other strategy, trying to get a good number for how much not just has burned, but actually that has been identified through remote sensing or other means has been lost to high severity fire. And then working through recommendations about how to incorporate climate change into that kind of reforestation planning so that you have durable forests going forward. So again, I don't have targets yet, and I'll probably be reaching out to Adam for some more information. And right now, what I'm thinking about looking at is some of the prioritizing forest health investments, that those recommendations from the Science Advisory Panel for the Forest Management Task Force, the old 2018 Forest Carbon Plan, and a bunch of stuff in the literature, but I'll be reaching out directly to a few people for more information.
And Laura, excuse me, folks, timing is everything when you're swallowing your lunch. I apologize. Laura, would you be willing to talk with us a little bit about this cross-cutting theme that we've discussed on supporting and enhancing natural systems functions?
I'm sorry, I've been locked out of the meeting for the last 5 or 10 minutes, so I'm not quite sure exactly where we are in the agenda, but I think what you're asking me to do is just say what we've discussed on the forest meeting.
Yes.
Around. Okay.
Yes.
Certainly. So I was putting together I had originally started thinking about this with respect to the forest, but we discussed that it might be more applicable as a cross-cutting paragraph or two, addressing the need to consider climate change in any of the restoration or management targets that we're developing. And so I'm putting together, I'll be putting together a draft set of principles that can hopefully cut across the different groups. And so if folks have either resource input on how that might come together, please feel free to reach out to me. But I will try and have a draft of that together for our next, whenever we next get together, or for one of the next small group meetings that I'm participating in. Is that
That's
enough?
terrific.
Okay, great, thanks.
One of the key things that we talked about is the linkage here between this work and California's 30 by 30 goals, and focusing in on actions and recommendations that help meet both of these things. So supporting a suite of native species and building off of that. That's a core principle, because the idea of enhancing the resilience of the natural function of these systems is something that we believe is cross-cutting. And that does have some real parallels and ties into the urbanscapes and WUI recommendations that we will be seeing coming out.
Matt has his hand up.
Yeah,
Thank you.
is it possible for us to get some kind of analytics out of the Natural Resources Agency programs? You got the portfolio of climate action plans or climate action or climate initiatives over there. You got the urban and community forestry program. You know, they had the research and education program at CAL FIRE. I mean, they've got history, they've got tread. It'd be nice to know what CAL FIRE knows about their forestry work thus far and what's been successful. And you know, I know they know a great deal about the co-benefits of urban forestry and the health protective value of that effort. But I felt kind of like I was poking around in the dark, taking guesses about saying that it's a good idea to plant trees when there's agencies that have been paid lots of money to do this for a very long time. And I don't think it's, I mean, I know we're experts, but it would be nice to review what the agency's been up to and maybe use that as a starting point for interrogating these strategies. Will it be possible for CAL FIRE to like show up on the natural and working lands experts advisory group, or are we just gonna guess at their work?
Well, maybe I could ask you to clarify a little bit. There is a tremendous amount of published and accepted data on, for example, volume of carbon in forest stands and how that changes over time.
Right.
So that's not something we necessarily need CAL FIRE to come in on. Are you asking for CAL FIRE's data around this excessive urban tree planting? It would just help to know a little bit more.
Planning, yeah, they have, you know, they have multiple restoration grants. I mean, they've been running these grants across the state, so it'd be nice. I mean, urban and community forestry would be the one I'd be most interested in. I don't want to presume that that's all that they've been doing with their CCI money.
Well, I'll touch base with Adam and Jen about having an expert speaker from CAL FIRE, I guess speaker from CAL FIRE, maybe a couple of other forest experts. Help spread the knowledge there and see what we can do in our next meeting.
Okay, yeah, I just was under the impression that the experts advisory group would have the faculties of the state agencies at our disposal. I didn't think, you know, I was going to do white paper research for the agency that's been funded to do this these past 15 years. It'd be cool to hear from them.
Yeah.
I was just checking, Matt, did you want something in addition to the presentation that was given to us about the scope of work that they already covered at the beginning of this process?
Yeah, I mean, you know, they have, I suppose it would make more sense to have our forest group meet with some of the CAL FIRE handlers. There maybe a regional forester that runs the urban and community forestry program. And as we've been talking about throughout this whole process, it's the regional granularity of the natural and working land strategy that's missing from the CARB scoping plan. And so to get our regional foresters to tell us what they know so that we can actually weight the value of this, because as we all agree, the benefits of natural and working lands have been undervalued in the traditional scoping plan. And so to get this agency to, you know, celebrate some of its work and tell us what's working and what's not, so that somebody in, you know, all I know is urban forestry, Lori, and I don't even know that, right? I just stick them in the ground. But to have somebody help us evaluate that, because in our scoping plan process, we're told that this forestry stuff's a net emitter, and we scratch it, and you know that's what lands us on engineered removal, along with, you know, biomass piles and stocks. And so, be nice to hear from the forestry department.
Well, why don't we take a little time to kind of narrow down what the request for them is? We can do that offline to some degree, and we'll look to get someone in. I think the issue here is, that I'm hearing from you, is relative benefit for investment and degree of success for investment in a range of forest and restoration activities. Is that what I'm hearing?
And also like intentional engagement from the Natural Resources Agency in this expert advisory group.
Okay, well, I think that my contacts within the agency have been very intentional, but I'm just teasing a little bit. But we will follow through and seek to get some good presentations on that. Other committee thoughts around what you're hearing from the members of the informal ad hoc working group on the forest focal area? There's one last area that I know we are going to be looking at, and that is recognizing the split in the private forest land ownership between the large owners and the small owners. While our top recommendation is really targeted where we believe we can get the most in the shortest period of time, we're also looking at what can be done in the smaller landowner arena to really engage and drive action at the smaller landowner level, because there are two key areas, coastal forests and foothill forests, where smaller ownerships dominate. And those are ones that we also want to see how we can make some recommendations around. We just haven't had the time to fully flesh that out as much, but we'll bring back more on that. With that, then why don't we move over to Delta and Blue Carbon? And you're going to lead us off there.
Sure.
Thank you.
I can start. So yeah, for the Delta and wetland carbon issues, Melissa and I have met a few times, and then Will and Matt and Melissa and I together once. Then separately, we had a meeting with Sylvia Truce, with Bonnie, and other NGO, the NGO community, and some scientists who are interested in coastal wetlands to get some input. And that was about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and that was very, very useful. So I think, as you all know, the scoping plan is really focused on delta wetlands. What we've actually been doing is trying to look at what additional wetlands could be incorporated into the scoping plan. So we've actually spent more time on that than we have on delta wetlands. And one recommendation that I make is that we really should include other coastal wetlands. So that coastal wetlands are relatively high return opportunity for carbon and for many other benefits. In terms of their carbon benefits, they're very useful because they have relatively high sequestration rates, and they don't, whereas most of the other, all of the other freshwater wetland systems are much more complicated in terms of identifying overall carbon benefits because of that. And in terms of looking at coastal wetlands, there's a very useful report that came out a year ago on carbon issues in coastal wetlands in San Francisco Bay from San Francisco Estuary Institute. And so that actually plotted the data on extent of wetlands, and as they use a series of different estimates to convert that to carbon burial that I think will be very useful for us. So that report's been very valuable in terms of San Francisco Bay wetlands, and there actually is probably a lot better information on dynamics in San Francisco Bay, but there are also data available for other coastal wetlands and other state initiatives in those coastal wetlands. The Southern California Wetlands Recovery Project has set goals for restoration in wetlands from Santa Barbara South. So there's very good information there, both in terms of the extent of existing wetlands and opportunities for restoration there. So those are some of the immediate opportunities outside of Southern California Coastal Wetlands Project. There's some data for Humboldt Bay and for the North Coast wetlands, but it's not as we haven't found as good data to areas of Southern California. And so that's mostly I'm talking about salt marshes in terms of coastal wetlands. There are other types of coastal wetlands. For those systems, there aren't nearly as good data, either in terms of extent or in terms of carbon dynamics. So for seagrass, the report that I mentioned from San Francisco Estuary Institute does look at seagrass issues or eelgrass issues, but there's probably a lot more uncertainty there. So I don't know if I think we probably won't be able to make as specific of recommendations around seagrass, although they could provide some real benefits. And Melissa probably can add much more on that since she is much more connected to the seagrass issues. But then similarly, kelp or inland freshwater wetlands, we haven't really looked as much detail in those. And similarly, as was highlighted for some systems, like for the riparian wetlands, there just aren't good maps for the extent of those wetlands statewide. So we're still in initial phases of looking at that. And then given those differences, our recommendations are going to likely be at very different levels for different types of systems across the state. One thing that we also have been thinking about beyond just looking at acres is looking at different types of restoration and what the benefits of different types of restoration would be for coastal wetlands. So thinking about, spatial issues or other management and restoration approaches. So we're trying to accumulate information around what kinds of recommendations we might be able to make around restoration approaches. That's similar to what was identified for coastal or for climate change impacts on forests. Coastal wetlands are highly vulnerable to sea level rise, and so sea level rises, but even in the relative near term, could have some significant impacts. So we're trying to look at what modeling efforts or what efforts we might be able to use to incorporate sea level rise and other climate change impacts on coastal wetlands. And then
Can I ask you a question?
yes,
So with sea level rise and the increased extent of wetlands, is that what you're wrapping your brain around? Is the shift inland of wetlands in terms of potential extent?
so two things. One is just are existing wetlands able to keep pace? So will they, if sea level rises too rapid, they'll get flooded and then they'll be converted from wetlands to mudflats and no vegetation growth from no carbon. And then they also at the upland edge could migrate.
Right.
And so both of those issues I think would have to be the really big impacts are likely to occur after 2050. So through 2050, there could be some changes, but it's the longer term impacts are where there could be some dramatic shifts.
Important temporal staging.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to break the flow. I just want to ask.
Okay. And then one other thing to highlight that's been mentioned is, looking at multiple benefits, and we haven't really thought about how. I mean, we've started to identify other benefits, but we haven't really thought through how we will incorporate that into recommendations and how we'll weigh relative benefits. So if I think that would be interesting to hear from other groups if you started to think about how you would look at feasibility issues and weighing both feasibility and mix co-benefits and how to take all those, weigh those various things and looking at final.
Yeah. Feasibility and practicality of can this be done? It's really good consideration.
So those are my, those are the notes I have. Lisa or Will or Matt, if there's anything else you guys would like to highlight.
Unless
I was just gonna say that was a really great summary from John. I don't actually have that much to add. I guess just that, like, part of the effort from John and I has been to get up to speed with all of the other existing targets that are out there from CARB already and SFEI and SQURP. Like, there are a multitude of documents that sort of state their own goals, and those goals could be made based on any number of priorities, whether that's cost, greenhouse gas reduction, feasibility. And so, catching up with what's out there so that we can then build upon that, and then sort of picking our justification about why we built upon it in the way that we did is sort of what we've been discussing, which John described effectively.
Thank you, Melissa. I just had a quick question. Maybe Adam or Matt can answer this. I remember we were talking about when we were heavy into the Delta carbon strategies, freshwater flows and allocations from DWR and State Water Resource Control Board, and just sort of the expectation that those would continue to diminish, right? So we're going to be methane off gassing from the tules and whatnot. Do we have any way to toggle the flows and talk about what if DWR didn't let them put in 2.3 million acres of irrigated grapevines in the desert in the next few years? Because we're talking about a natural sequestration system that's just being starved, and there are co-benefits to that as well, right? Besides being able to sequester carbon with tule grass, which actually holds off the hyacinth. I'm in a city with 300 40,000 people, and you can't go near the water because of harmful algal blooms like the entire year. And so those beneficial uses are also discarded as we double down on irrigation and profiteering. So I don't know if there's, the delta's super useful if water flows through it.
Yeah, I think this is exactly why we brought up the method of restoration, because a lot of these existing documents just say restore X acreage of wetland, but they don't say how. And so if that is just going and planting plants, the carbon offset and all the benefits would look totally different than a restoration of natural tidal flow or reduced dredging or changes to the hydrology. And so we've been grappling with not just saying restore X acres, but restore X acres in this way, and all of the outcomes could change depending on that.
I mean, just remembering this last winter and the few places that had multi-benefit flood control, infrastructure built into them, people not losing their houses. There's a lot of carbon in tearing down a house and rebuilding it.
Yeah. I would be, from a personal standpoint, I think it would be nice to get into that, within our goals, basically. Yeah. Restore X acres of salt marsh in, by one approach, you may get some amount of greenhouse gas benefit or carbon benefit, but to compare that to an approach that you just described with changing hydrology would be interesting.
And I bring it up because I kind of want to remind the committee that, we're being hung on a cross of carbon in this state's planning. There's, short-lived climate pollutants, and then there's, compliance with the law and the overburdening, the additional burdening of overburdened communities. And, that's a crime, right? In California, you can't do that. So we have to be really careful about what we decide to restore and where we decide to restore it. And that this budget's a moral document. So if we go and, restore the shorelines down in Monterey and San Luis, and we're kind of spending money where the state's already got money, and that there's, we died 13 years earlier in the Central Valley, and maybe this climate transition can be a just transition that actually helps keep people alive. And that math is sorely missing from the CARB scoping plan. And so hopefully natural resources can help us accommodate that literacy.
I'm going to suggest a couple things. One is it possible to get from DWR an estimate on, or from anybody in resources, an estimate on avoided emissions associated with maintaining existing wetlands as opposed to further draining them off? And that is a really interesting point that you brought forward.
Thank you, Lori, for having the words to say what I didn't know how to say it.
Well, I think that it would be, obviously, CARB always has to look at its, assessing economic, social, political feasibility, but it would be interesting to have a sense of if there is a scale of projected loss of these wetlands as we are siphoning off more water, and what we could retain in the way of existing functioning systems and existing stocks if we don't. That is not knowledge that I don't think anybody on the committee has that. I'm getting a head nod from Jen that she will look into this. Is that?
I will.
Okay.
Yeah. I could almost make that same statement and insert agriculture. It's the same because I'm getting a little ahead of myself. We'll talk about it, but the white paper that represented it was the state legislation, state legislature that looked at avoided costs of development, and that it was, avoiding the urban emissions was a benefit. Maybe you want to say it since it's your first, but make it from. We can wait. We can
come back and go to it distinctly, but I think you're hearing some thoughts around changing existing economic industries drivers, shall we say, in favor of maintaining some system function. And maybe there are ways that we can get there that are feasible because we better understand the scale of gain that could be made or loss that could be avoided if we made some other choices.
And I would add to that, like, it may not be practical, right? Like talking these ranches into not taking more water may not be in the short-term solution thing. And I would just love to have somebody be really honest with me about that. Like, Matt, we're never going to turn the spigot off for these guys. They have senior water rights and they stole them for 1914. And, you know, their economics matter more than, you know, your survivorship. And then we can move on. But I keep asking about, does the state manage its waters for beneficial uses? I mean, it says it does in language, but we had to get the US EPA to sue California over this, and that maybe there could be a gesture of goodwill in this climate planning to let the feds know that we're actually going to manage state waters for all Californians in the 30 by 30 plan and in the scoping plan.
So I'm just going to do a little time check here for us. And I know that some groups don't have as much to report out as others at this juncture, but we are coming up on 2 o'clock and we have 4 more subgroups to report out. So but just to give them a chance to discuss where they are before we move into a break and then to our expert speaker. So I don't want to cut off conversation, but I do want to make sure that everybody has a chance to present some of their work. So with permission, unless there are other key questions on Delta and blue carbon, we move to perennial agriculture. Will that be you, Carrie?
So we've decided in our group that we're combining perennial and ag together. So I'll just report on our work for both. I'm going to report out on the reflections of the work group. So I should clarify that any opinions expressed are from the work group or from myself and do not reflect the policies of the USDA or the federal government since they work for the USDA. So even that, I'm going to first talk about some of our initial actions, and then we are still very much in the discussion phase, but I'll identify some of the actions that are coming to the talk and some of our concerns. Given that our positionality of our committee, many of us have been participating in listening committees to augment our understanding of the issues in front of us and the current concerns. So I'll just list briefly that we've met with listening sessions with Calcan, the Nature Conservancy, the Carbon Institute, CCOF, the Natural Resource Conservation District, and also met with fellow scientists to try and identify and relied on our own expertise for this process. And so we're looking at actions, but trying to think about it in a systematic way. We're looking at the system in general because agriculture is both regional and affected by climate. It is also something that's managed at a broad level across the state in terms of policies. And we wanted to look at ways that we could reduce the nitrous oxide emissions. So we're looking at integrated fertilizer management and improvements in soil fertility. We've looked at, of course, programs that have been successful, like the Healthy Soils program. So for an example, these are the kinds of things that we are interested in learning more about, is like, what is the investment target for something like that? What could be reached if there were greater investments in that particular program? We've also discussed some cross-cutting issues, looking at pesticide reduction as a means to reduce energy inputs. And looking at how that might also dovetail with increases in organic production across the state and what that might mean for carbon storage. And also for one of the things, for example, like looking at the complexity of that is that if we're going to be increasing certain kinds of production practices or production systems to make sure that there's a market available for those materials for the growers. We also are aware that making recommendations can have unintended impacts. I'm reading Amy Carter's childhood autobiography right now. It talks about, when the federal government first instated mandates across agriculture for cotton production in the Southeast and what that did and how growers were actually really negatively affected by that. So that's, in mind, keeping in mind that any of these recommendations have to be embraced or like vetted or discussed with stakeholders. And so that's a recommendation that will go forward within our report.
if the committee agrees. And let's see, another thing is that since there's like we think that a cross-cutting issue is riparian restoration as well, and understanding how to connect up with the forest committee and also with the wetlands committee or the wetlands efforts, because both of those systems often occur on. So we're trying to figure out how do we meet Bagley King yet still connect with our colleagues and make sure that we're doing something that's synthetic across the landscape. And then the final one is that there's been a lot of discussion about capacity building at the regional level, and looking at how we can structure that. And I think that's still nebulous, but there's been some discussion about what kind of governance structures are in place that may hinder or that may advance that kind of capacity building at the local level to meet goals, and so that stakeholders can tailor their practices to their region and we have climate adaptation embedded within that. So I think there's a lot of practices that we'll consider. I think the committee is open and willing for feedback. And I think I'm going to stop there, but I want to make sure that my colleagues have an opportunity to add in what they would like to add in.
And could I also just thank you for coming up all the way today for the meeting? Very much appreciated. I think you may have had the longest journey of anybody to get here. So just that effort and input is really, really meaningful. Thank you. Would either of you?
Sure. Just to follow up on Carrie's comments. Yeah, I think that we miss in this conversation is keeping ag land, and not converting it to other uses. So ag land does emit, but converting it to other uses means that it could emit seven times more than what ag land does. So preserving ag land should be a critical issue, just to maintain carbon on the landscape, let alone try to sequester carbon. And the other issue from sort of raised is about water availability. And I know there's some scenarios suggesting to take agricultural land out of production, which I think would be extremely counterintuitive. It may be unavoidable since water availability is what it is. But taking ag land out of production would also lead to extensive loss of soil carbon and emission of greenhouse gases. So keeping the land productive is probably one of the more primary outcomes that we should be striving for. That would be much more important than organic amendments, which is important. You know, the diversion of organic wastes from landfills to agricultural land is an important thing. It's probably the best use of these organic amendments because they can keep these lands more water use efficient, address some of the water problems. And so there's sort of a complex array of things that we need to think about to bring things together.
And then, Bill, I'd like to bring you through work that looks at building capacity of our system for climate adapted cover crops, as well as improving. That's a limitation.
That's a limitation. Cover crops are an interesting thing. They're a great soil health thing to do. And they would love to do it, but they hate it because they have to manage cover crops in a period of time where they don't have labor force anymore employed. Our districts are shut off the water, so getting a successful cover crop is a problem. Then if they do, and the spring comes and they have excessive rains, the cover crop gets out of control and they can't plant their main crop. And so cover crop management is an issue, and I'm not sure how to address it, but yet it is one of the best things to do for soil health and soil carbon sequestration. So I'm not sure how we need more research basically because we don't understand the ways that we can help farmers utilize approaches like this without affecting their bottom lines. We can't just say, yeah, cover crops are great, but there's so many obstacles that are there. You just don't have information accurately portray to farmers to utilize the management approach. Yeah. So the conversion to micro irrigation has been successful. Water use efficiency has increased dramatically. Unfortunately, it also has increased water use dramatically. And that's because productivity of the landscape has increased dramatically under micro irrigation. So yes, you use more water, but each crop uses less water. The productivity uses less water. So it's much more efficient, but more water is used. That's the Jevons paradox that was stated in 1850 by a Dutch economist. Efficiency creates more resource utilization.
Are just great example. We got so many ways.
Right. And so what that has done right now is, for example, tomato production systems used to be around 300,000 acres. We're now 200,000 acres, and they produce the same amount of tomatoes. Fortunately, the under 100,000 acres has gone to other crops like almonds, which use much more water. And so we would have to sort of understand the cropping patterns to understand what the potential for carbon sequestration is, and or global warming mitigation is, and what farmers can actually produce in a reasonably efficient way.
Can I ask a quick question before we go to? So one of the things that came up in the forest group was, of course, when you do fuels management, you produce a lot of chip. What do you do with that chip? And you can either be more energy intensive in how you use that chip, like on the East Coast where they ship it over to Europe where it's combusted, but there's a lot of CO2. It's a very CO2 intensive process, actually, unless you just assume that empty ships would be crossing the ocean. Anyway, so from what you're talking about there in terms of adding organic material, potentially through, for example, utilization of chip or biochar, are you looking at, there's a potential for a more closed loop system within the state of California, potentially. Just wondering if you're looking at that or discussed that. That is a cross-sectoral issue or cross-focal area issue there.
It is, and unfortunately, there's not a lot of information that we can draw upon to say that, yeah, this is a good way to go. And so we need more information. I know as a department chair, researchers in my department are putting in lots of grant proposals to the Department of Energy to look at this issue. So we just don't have a lot of information on this yet. But how to close the loop between all these waste materials we have in California and where they would be best utilized. For example, create better water efficiency in systems where water is limited.
So this might be a very particular recommendation for action by the state to have a focused. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for mentioning the Jevons paradox. Well, that was great. I think that's my theme of the week. I have a couple additions and just wants to highlight. I definitely am excited about and most focused on the cover crops and the organic conversions. I think that despite the challenges, the information gap challenges we have there are a lot of good innovation hubs, which you've also mentioned that we can connect and highlight those, uplift those innovation hubs. It's going to be useful, especially around research, fairly recent research out of UC Davis around cover crops. But that posting legislation highlighting that as a closed loop system. I also want to lift up the need for us to get an economist to talk to us about some of the system functionality components and efficiency risks even. I think about that in terms of organic conversion. That the only example of that I know of a mandated organic conversion is the Sri Lankan unmitigated disaster. So, and not that I would trust an economist to come in and have some biblical knowledge for us, given the state of the stock market and the recommendations that we might have around that.
Are you saying that there's variability in economic?
I didn't no quote me. I said nothing like that. But nonetheless, it would be nice to have some more broader perspective on something that could be as impactful as mandating or recommending scale shift in the sector. Other than that, I think there are some aspirational or actually one other kind of baseline set of knowledge that I'd like to get firmer about. I know that Sigma has been talked about already, but I really don't understand how that impacts patients yet. So I'd like to get some knowledge on that too. The aspirational components, or maybe other kind of things that I'm thinking about, animal integration into farmlands is something that hasn't been talked about much in Health and Soils program or researched much to my knowledge. And I think that it is a very old system and it's something that's farmers. It's a closed loop system. There's a lot of capacity to integrate into forestry systems for fuel production, but it would be entirely aspirational. I don't think aspiration. It's uncharted territory for me. One other thing I think that you touched on, Carrie, was the crop, and a little bit too, was crop patterns and crop selection. I think that's something that might even be a primary focus of our work is how are we bringing together the breeding programs that are that focused on climate adaptability within crops, research about crop rotations, how that can impact fertility, resilience within farming communities, bring that all together into strong recommendations around what crops, when they're grown, how they're rotated, specific species, all that together. The last thing I would say is that village reduction is often out in these terms, and that's a black box for me.
I think that there's been maybe significant, might be overstating it, but there's been a lot of research looking at the relationship between tillage and no-till systems, and we'll have some papers on it, but it's looking like the tillage is doing some distribution of that carbon that's accruing in the surface. So it may just be a deeper depth, and also be a downward movement of carbon for the living area. So it's maybe lost in the system. I mean, maybe a much, depending on the system.
And I mean, we don't have a lot of data. We only have one project in the state of California that we ran for 20 years. We were all jumping up and down because we saw this great carbon sequestration in the plow layer, or what would be the plow. There was 30 centimeters on the first foot in the no-till system. But once you looked at a meter deep and the systems, there was no difference in carbon. So there's savings. So there's reasons to do no-till. You know, there's fuel savings, there's water infiltration savings, there's water efficiency savings. So there's reasons to do no-till, but not probably for carbon or for carbon sequestration.
Is this fundamentally the difference between what they call the labile carbon and the stable carbon, which is the long-term soil carbon?
Right.
Yeah.
It's more labile also.
Yeah.
So we have to be sure that there's no corrosive potential,
Right.
that the system stays on production. Otherwise, you would lose that carbon.
Right. And that is a big challenge for no-till just in general. And some of the work actually that early on showed that, you might not till for 5 years, but then you were releasing 5 years worth of carbon when you did that. So it's helpful to think about that.
I'd like to recognize Matt, but before we do, I just want to make it clear to the listeners that we have also read through the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee recommendations for ag. So have comparing what we're doing to existing advisory reports that are out there, like sustainable pest management. So, yeah.
Yeah, I kind of got scooped on the recommendation for crop selection or species selection. Davis did the great job with that whole orchard recycling study, and so most of the tree ranchers, nut ranchers have come along on that. It's really the grapevine dealers. They won't do the recycling for whatever reason. So we're still burning those, right? We're still burning those in Stockton, where we don't grow grapes or drink wine. But they drive Lodi's garbage down to us, and they throw the largest emitting source of nitrous dioxide on us, and they're still throwing all the carbon in the sky. And so, I know almonds are thirsty, but at least the almond ranchers will recycle the tree, right? Or they'll soil incorporate it. And it's really silly how much pasture land is being turned over into grapevines. I don't know how many people have driven around the northern San Joaquin Valley of late, but we're putting in a ton of irrigation for a crop, for an industry that insists on burning it, refusing to follow best science, and they're building gold-plated tasting rooms the whole time they're complaining about how expensive it is to be rich. And so the state helps them do all that. So I think like a forceful recommendation from an experts group that was really honest about, helping people sell wine. And of course, their glass factories are pretty nasty stuff too. So it's an industry it's a bad actor, and it can be addressed. And then the other thing, what was it I wanted to ask about? Laura, you brought up the wood chips thing. They don't just do that on the East Coast. Golden State Natural Resources Agency is promoting and proposing the largest wood pellet factory in the world in Lassen County. They're going to store those in Stockton, but just because all the Bay Area ports are too good for it, and they're going to summon 2,500 ocean-going vessels a year, burning heavy diesel oil to ship it over to Japan, who are still going to throw it in the same atmosphere, as far as I'm aware. I think they still have the same climate as we do. So California is working at cross purposes right now. And I just can't imagine that 100 million metric tons of California forests going across the ocean is what any expert would recommend. So just to raise literacy on that. And the same promoting agency is somehow the CEQA authorizing agency. I guess that helps us meet those 2045 goals that are so important. But just sharing that with this committee. It's a crazy project. And I think all the wood pellet piles blow up at some point. And I'm not looking forward to that day when there's a fire they can't put out in Stockton.
I think one of the closed loop suggestions is getting a lot of excellent Carrie.
I just want to clarify for Matt that wine grapes can't ship their vineyards because of disease pressure, but I'm sure there's other things they might be able to do.
Yeah, they always complain about the wire, but they got the monofilament in Europe. And maybe they just don't need to sell so many drugs.
Let's take that. I'm going to just suggest, because we are now at we have 45 minutes till we want to break for public comment. So I do want to move. Any last questions on the agriculture side? Anybody online and not see hands? Thank you, Matt, thank you for bringing my attention. I sometimes may miss somebody on the screen because I'm looking at people here. I apologize. Do we need to stand up and stretch, or could we roll right into grasslands? We're going to roll right into grasslands. Okay. Who is going to speak for grasslands?
Yes, I am. Chelsea's not here.
She is not.
Well, Chelsea has to be virtual and
I
figure
don't
this
think
out.
she's actually come on to she wasn't on for the roll call. So.
I think
unless she
she's
came
now,
out-
Oh, yeah,
it's out here, but Chelsea can only participate as a member of the public, so,
Well, let's have William.
yeah,
speak.
and then Chelsea can share her thoughts in the public comment period.
So our grasslands committee. We met twice. And we have Connor Corbin. We've met twice. And still sort of in the beginnings of our data gathering. Finding grasslands is kind of an issue. So for example, doing a search of grassland area in California gets you anywhere from 7 to 60 million acres. I think 7 million acres is probably more a reasonable number. Estimates are that 1/3 of that is grazed, and most of it is annual grasslands. Meaning that you have annual species where previously to Western invasion, it was all prairie grassland. One of the conclusions we come with the committee is that using grasslands for climate mitigation presents significant challenges. Those including diverse biogeochemistry, because the grasslands are located in California, but where they're located as sort of a bathtub ring around the Great Valley presents all sorts of different geochemical materials. Climate operations, coastal grasslands are different than valley grasslands. For example, climate is something working against grasslands. Mediterranean climate produces sort of unequilibrium conditions because of the rain distribution, where grasslands can only be productive during certain parts of the year, particularly winter, when winter rains come, for example. Again, I mentioned diverse soil types, everything from mollisols and second soils, burr soils, some very different soil types in these grasslands. And because of the Mediterranean climate and sort of the severeness of the summers where grasslands sort of go dormant, it's a very strong check on the ability to sequester carbon in these grasslands. They tend to top out at about 2 to 3% soil carbon, regardless of sort of the physical condition you find them. There's lots of because of that, there's lots of unknowns. Therefore, it's difficult to come up with specific strategies to address climate mitigation, for example. So it almost would have to be sort of a place-based type of approach for many of these areas, depending on what the current materials are, what the soil types are, things like that. What's possible is, as with ag, the prevention of preventing grassland conversion is probably one of the best things that can happen, because that would preserve a lot of carbon. What can we do to enhance? It's probably maybe some restoration activities, particularly croplands that are sort of margin croplands that should be converted back to grasslands, for example. Riparian restoration, which is also cross-cutting to other ecosystems, for example, forests and even croplands. And then organic amendments have been looked at and is also being pushed by the CDFA. Jury is still out on whether that is a reasonable approach to sequester carbon because of the amounts that are needed and because of the distances needed to transport the materials. It's wet, 50% water. Probably the best use for these organic amendments, particularly compost, particularly food waste compost, are ag lands where you can bring more resilience, climate resilience to the system. Organic amendments in grasslands are possible saturation of nitrogen and phosphorus, erosion into riparian areas. So things would have to be very careful. Bringing in species that are not suitable for grazing are all things that are kind of unknowns. We put on that path. Silvopasture is probably an approach, and that's kind of proven approach that's been used around the world. Not so much research again in California, so these are a lot of unknowns. So maybe more suggestions than we actually have recommendations. So conclusion so far, there's insufficient research on grazing systems that would augment carbon. Grazing in itself can demonstrate some carbon sequestration or cannot. And there's just not enough research to say there's one prescription that fits out. More music areas would probably respond more. So more coastal areas would probably respond better to any management interventions that we might suggest versus the more dry inland areas in the inland. But again, a location-based again, single management approach won't work for all. Besides the fact that all, particularly the grasslands. I think maybe we shouldn't concentrate on soil carbon sequestration and more concentrate on ecosystem services. So maintaining soil carbon or trying to enhance soil carbon through restoration, for example, probably brings much more benefits than the carbon sequestration itself. So we should look at that. And again, preventing conversion prevents a lot of emissions. And greenhouse gases.
That's a good question. One is, I'm wondering if we might want to stop talking about preventing conversion and talking about ensuring continuation. Because what happens when you talk about preventing conversion, it's like, is the bulldozer at your door? Let me stop it now. That's the most expensive possible way to stop conversion. And what we're talking about is large-scale landscape function. And so I just want to put it forward with the committee that we're talking about ensuring continuation of certain land use, land types. That's a thought. My question for you, which is also a question for you, if you would accept that as a way to phrase that. But my question for you is, the silvopasture, and we're talking about oak, reestablishing our oaks that have been lost and that were so carefully blown out with dynamite in order to make more pasture and orchards and so on. Is there a connection here that we could potentially make as a linkage in terms of our oak restoration goals and our restoration or maintenance of grasslands?
Yes, it's a great idea. It's an idea that we should pursue. My lab has published on this. The concept of islands of fertility, where you underneath these oaks in these grasslands have much more soil carbon, you have much more soil fertility. Cattle actually like the shade, but the trees were removed to increase grassland productivity. And now we're finding it very difficult to establish those trees. And we haven't really figured out a way to be very consistent about reestablishing these trees. So that's a severe research limitation of that.
That's very inconsistent.
It's very inconsistent. But years like we had over the past winter seem to be natural regeneration processes for these. But it's a hit and miss thing. So it's quite problematic to reestablish these silvopasture. Maybe we could think of different trees, eucalyptus. I've worked with eucalyptus systems.
Way too many allopathic chemicals in the soil. There's a hand up on the screen, but also Debbie, were you going to add?
Sure, I'll just add, or maybe just kind of underline or emphasize this idea of ensuring continued, land use. And that, we have a lot of grasslands in California, there's a lot of carbon sequestered in them. So maintaining kind of the land use, the landscape as grassland and much of those grasslands is grazing. And that I think there are a lot of practices under the Healthy Soils program, working with the Natural Resources Conservation Service that can help ranchers maintain that soil carbon. So I think those are some activities that might not necessarily increase carbon sequestration, but can help maintain those carbon stocks. Things like water development, cross fencing, things like that help ranchers manage those landscapes, but also help protect soils. So I think, and those practices have a lot of co-benefits. I think there are a lot of co-benefits from those kinds of things. So I think on the grassland side, it adds the so many of the other, groups that have given their updates that I think is what we can do to meet. As they are.
I guess I forgot to mention some things like nitrogen fertilization and phosphorus fertilization of grasslands could be options. Phosphorus, in particularly, to increase nitrogen fixation, increase the productivity of grasslands. And we don't have a lot of information on that in California. Burning management, it's not been looked at from sort of soil carbon lens. Irrigation definitely works, but water availability is a problem. So there are these other things that we could possibly address. Increase productivity grass.
Learning management would fit into some of the traditional ecological knowledge context and equity issues. I cannot tell.
The public comment. The hand raised is a public comment.
Okay, we're going to get to public comment at 3 o'clock. So I was wondering who that was, but to be or not to be, if you could hold on until 3, that would be much appreciated. Are there any other questions on, or not questions, but observations and discussion on grasslands, or should we move to deserts?
An observation that's maybe not specific to grasslands, but I think highlighted by what you were just saying, which I agree with. I've had the same kind of like uncertainties, when I look around also at grasslands and other spaces. And so I'm going to bring something up, and I don't have a solution to offer, but what that is the recommendations that these our subcommittees or committee will eventually make, some of them have a lot of uncertainty and some of them don't have a lot of uncertainty. And both of those things are fine. When we know that we have a lot of uncertainty, then at least we can move forward. But, this is just sort of a big question for the room, and maybe we can discuss as a group later as it makes sense. I don't want to get into the way of this timeline here. By 3 o'clock that we need to make, but just how do we, if we are making recommendations that we feel have a great deal of uncertainty or not a great deal of uncertainty, how are we integrating that into our final draft at some point? And that's just something, I don't have a solution for it. I'm thinking about this when I hear kind of your report out, and I'm just like, these are exciting ideas. The experiments, are they real? How do we communicate that in the best way? So I guess I'm just kind of throwing out into the air right now, just that kind of, how do we deal with uncertainty?
One of the things that we did bring up in the template is that there's a kind of a ranking by color of degrees of certainty. And we also agreed that we wanted to be making as our top recommendations those things that we knew would be positive. Yeah. And we knew could be scaled and rolled out, and we knew could have benefits in the 5 to 10 year period, as well as ongoing from there. So my suggestion with that framing that we already did was that we can have a section on, kind of in investments, you talk about degrees of uncertainty in your return. They could be high return, but they're also highly uncertain. So in terms of that quadrant of, we're aiming for the things that are in the high certainty, high return within a known period of time, but there are also things to be looked at that have unknown delivery, but high promise. So we may end up with either as an appendix or as a listing underneath the top recommendations that we know can be actually rolled out and on the ground.
So that ranking is kind of becoming our
it becomes a sieve. It doesn't mean we lose those really interesting thoughts and promising avenues, but we did make a commitment that here we're going to be really focused on those things that were known, no regrets, scalable, and within 5 to 10 years would have impact.
You mentioned about the difficulties of reestablishing hooks. Is there an analogous in reestablishing grasslands into fallow cropland? Whatever metrics are helpful.
I don't think there's, okay. It's easier to convert into a grassland. It's harder to ensure that you have the right species count. So birding management, things like that. Some kind of management, purpose management would have to be done. You want to create a functional grassland that could be used for grazing, for example. Grazing.
Follow-up question. I'm assuming there's programmatic examples of people working on both.
Yes, regeneration.
Is there
There's been decades of that research, and we still are still kind of floundering.
is there comparable boots on the ground programs for grassland reestablishment?
I think the limitation in grassland reestablishment is seed source supply. Not too many suppliers of seed. And I think we've run the same issue with cover crops for agriculture. If everyone did want to do cover crops, it wouldn't be enough seed. So it's seed supply. So an industry would have to be sort of produced or grown to do that. That would be missing.
It's a challenge too for the native grass restoration, depending on where you want to see it. Like you were saying earlier, as in the wetter parts of the state, you're gonna have a lot more success with that. Or getting more of the drier parts of the state. You get lucky, you get a really good rainfall that year. You get some successful germination, but 5 years later, you don't know how much you produce. So I think part of the challenge for the grass restoration is where you are in the state.
Hey, can we move to deserts? And Marion, are you reporting out for the deserts group?
Yeah, I can do that. I'll have a pretty short report out. I would say we've met not all together, but one-on-one. Scheduling has been a little bit of a problem, but we've been making a little bit of progress since we've been doing that. And where we're at is really right now just identifying some experts that we can speak with, and there's some folks that you see Riverside and other institutions, the Mojave Desert Land Trust, the Center for Conservation Biology, that may be able to help us answer some of our questions. We've identified some of the reports out there that may be also able to help inform us. And then finally, again, the WCB has a pretty new program that was established, I think, in 2021 around deserts and desert conservation. So we're reaching out to them as well with the hopes that maybe they can help us think about how they've thought about their strategy and implementation of their grant program too. We did, and then the other thing that I thought was pretty interesting is that Anza Borrego State Park is, I think, one of the largest state park in California, maybe in the country, right? And so they've been managing sort of deserts, the large desert with public and non-public access use out there too. So I think they're a very good source of information to go to as well. We had just one kind of question that, since the ag folks are in here too, we're trying to delineate, is ag in the desert regions, we're thinking about places like Imperial Valley, is that considered desert or ag, agriculture? And so we're trying to understand kind of like what to bring in. Yeah.
Myself. We should also ask the state, but when the state made these delineations.
Agriculture in the desert for us is agriculture.
Interesting.
You guys.
Yeah, exactly. Sure. Well, no, I mean, I think that's a good.
I mean,
But what I'm saying is just a good way to connect up, thinking about this, the following of land and what happens to it with respect to different ecoregions. So that was the question.
Yeah, so some of the challenges that we've identified or that, there are challenges that exist around monitoring, modeling. Desert biogeochemistry is also pulse driven, it's hard to capture. Influx is key substantial. Inorganic carbon is a critical carbon that we will not currently capture, so we're trying to wrap our heads around some of those items. We see pluses. So the opportunities are largest for I'll say, the continuing protection of these lands and avoided loss. And opportunities for carbon sequestration are likely lesser given the low productivity of this land type, but the protection and avoided losses is also just mass. Land mass offers a lot of opportunity there. So we're, like I said, we're kind of in the beginning of pulling together this information, had those initial discussions, trying to pull in a little bit more data and expertise as we can. And now we uploaded ag in the desert area to the agricultural area. So that gets us closer. In our group is Connor and also Chelsea. Connor's not here. I think you said Chelsea can't interact right now. Is that right? Okay, so I was going to open it up to Chelsea to add anything else.
Oh, sorry, audio broke up. I wanted to see if anybody, because I don't know the 30 by 30 plan that well. Wasn't there a pledge to fallow land in there? I know Wade Crowfoot was talking about fallowing land, and then I saw everybody's faces when we talked about agriculture in the desert. Now it gets pretty silly, doesn't it? I don't know. They might actually go for it down there because they're going to be digging up all the lithium in Imperial now. Might want that more than bok choy. But fallowing places that never should have been in agriculture is certainly a recommendation that an expert group can make. And then also when you talked about the propagation of oak trees and seeds, I did want you to know that CAL FIRE actually has a program that prioritizes establishing, industry scale nurseries in disadvantaged communities for the propagation of forestry supplies. I don't know how many of you remember, it was like 7 years ago, Apple and Google bought all the trees in the state and nobody could plant a cork oak. And so the state tried to create a grant program to hire hard to hire populations into climate work. So there are just transition strategies around some of these things. We heard Will talk earlier about the farmers not having the labor when they want it, and that's just because they won't pay them, right? They just won't pay them that time of year. But the state will. I mean, the state's got tons of coins. So I don't know if this might not be the group to make just transition recommendations, but the idea that there's not enough money to pay for people to do urgent work in the greatest wealth creating agricultural region in all of human history is something we could say. We could say, you guys make enough money, you have to pay for people to manage a cover crop. They'll still be in the black. So that's just my comment. And then I don't have the chat, but it's like 60 degrees in this room in Riverside, and it's 101 outside, and it's the carb building, and I'm all alone. I'm freezing to death. So I'm gonna go off camera and go find a thermostat. Sorry.
This is carbs energy saving strategy.
Yeah, I don't know why the room's so cold.
But it's the building we built to make sure we all still get to drive cars forever.
It is a net zero building now, so take pride in that. It's cold.
It's super cool, Matt. I must say, I geeked out today. I didn't understand any of it, but it was cool.
Well, part of being super cool is being super cool. Okay. Is there anything else on deserts? Or I know that both shrublands and urbanscapes are relatively limited in what they're going to be reporting out. Is there anything else further on deserts that folks want to raise? Okay. Well, shrublands, this was Steve Lara, Deputy Barca leads there. And I'm not sure that you guys have had a chance to meet. Debbie, will you report out, or Christy, or?
So maybe, I don't know if Christy has more information. I sort of because I've been away for a while, just learned that it was on my review. So, and I'm not sure if they've met without me. No, okay. So we need to find a time to meet in the next maybe few weeks.
Okay.
Yep, that's what we have to report. We've all been working on our other committee assignments and we have not gotten organized to meet yet, but we are looking forward to it.
And Laura, you are a core member of that committee as well. So thank you for your help within that. And Chelsea was an adjunct in that. Urbanscapes, and this is Mark, who is not present, Matt, who's gone off camera, but I think is still here, and Carrie is core with myself as to the side. So, or associated with it, part of it, but just not bearing the brunt of it. So, would Matt or Carrie be willing to speak in the absence of Mark?
Sure. So we have not progressed since we last met and presented the working document to the committee on May 22nd. We're working in the agricultural system, and from listening to you all, urbanscapes are not necessarily just in our large urban areas. I know that there's discussion initially about trying to ensure connectivity to the practices that are suitable for that region. Mark brought up the issue of climate stressors in different regions. It might make sense to plant trees, but if it's an incredibly hot area, we might be also putting a lot of water out there. I think we need to spend some more time thinking about how this is going to plan out, because I don't think we just want to go forward with tree planting. That's just but we are going to go to the literature and listen to others at listening sessions, hopefully. But yeah, we still have to, we got to get going on it.
Well, there are some of these cross-cutting recommendations that I hope feed in, such as the emphasis on utilization of native species within the kind of incorporation of biological impacts within inherently biological systems.
Right. And I think also thinking about forward development, and I'm not sure how this works within the context of this mission that we've been given, but thinking about development that will be going forward in the zero emissions communities, trying to understand how does this effort fit within that from the beginning. I know that there's potentially a planned community building. If it's approved in Davis, it has this as a priority. So just thinking through examples like that, I would need input or guidance from others on how to call that out properly in a report like this, but or at least the members of the committee would need guidance on that. So that those are things that we could put forward. I think I'm looking to you all because I would need feedback from you if that's our purview.
Can you give that feedback now or not?
So what is?
Well, I mean, like things that, so there are things that we can do, I guess, that the committee could discuss that can be inserted into our existing landscape. But then there are other things that we know that there is going to be development of urban areas because we have such a housing crisis here. How do those two efforts dovetail together and help us meet this carbon reduction issue or carbon neutrality issue? And so I'm not sure if the members of this committee have the background and language to make those kinds of recommendations for planning new development and how these principles of the scoping plan fit into that. But they are natural landscape type recommendations that we can make. So I guess I'm just thinking off the top of my head here, as you might be able to tell. So I guess I'm just wondering, like, is that in our purview, or is there somebody who's within the state that we would connect with to help us articulate those kinds of targets and implementation pathways?
So fundamentally, we're asking about how much of land use planning at large is within our purview to make. And are we doing simple recommendations like promoting infill as opposed to exurban sprawl? I mean, these are simple things, but as you have pointed out, Adam, it's like the difference between managing dairy methane and looking at what's going on in the ground, the biological carbon as opposed to the herd management necessarily per se. So can you give us any guidance there?
Yeah, I mean, I can shot at this, but I mean, what we did, at least on the scoping plan side, was come up with B&T reduction targets that we included in the scoping plan for 2030, 2045, and those B&T reduction targets also included a local actions appendix that supported some of those targets with respect to the types of strategies that locals could take to help achieve both the gas reduction targets in the scope of and the B&T reduction targets that we included in there. Because we looked at it from a statewide perspective, broadly that's the purview of the committee too, we didn't come in and say like, okay, this region or this individual shall develop like a no land use conversion policy, for instance, that was too far into the local planning process or to get given also it's like 375 shit that happens, right? Strategies. We tried to navigate this to some extent in a natural working lands work by putting in place recommended implementation targets that looked at land conversion in certain areas, or like on wetlands, for instance, like restoration targets that we changed to the land use type. But we stayed away from saying like where that should happen specifically in the state, knowing that individual regions and cities. I think you can point to some of the aggressive B&T targets that we put in the scoping plan, since that's approved by the board and the state strategy, to say how land-based management actions should help support also the B&T reduction targets, because they are, I mean, the board acted with some pretty strong B&T reduction targets in that. So that's a complementary objective that feeds the sector. The other question about growth in land use change and how does that factor into like urban tree canopy? We did not model development and land use change in scoping plans to think about like how are the boundaries of the individual city, for instance, over time. We just looked at what kind of the existing land use is. This is something that I've made some comments about that I'd like to be able to evaluate going forward. It's just, it's a huge step up in analysis for us. And so doing that type of work is not a simple or quick thing for all time and resource constraint, right? So from that perspective, there was also that bill, which one of us that passed on that urban tree canopy target, the 10%.
Right.
Yeah.
25.
Yeah.
Something.
Which is what Cal Fire talked about.
Right.
In Marty's presentation.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so they're also grappling with that target that they have to set, which is also, a question of like, how do you quantify the existing tree? So what is happening? How do you track it? All of these things are on the table. So I would say you're welcome to make land use recommendations as part of the committee, and that's something you can certainly do. But doing so, it's going to kind of get into all these other questions about like how to
Couple things just to build on that. EMT is vehicle miles traveled.
Yeah,
That's pretty cool. I didn't know that coming in. But okay, and then yeah, so also in the scoping plan, like for deserts, for example, we recommended decreasing conversion into deserts. So development in deserts, especially by 50% from the current rate or something like that. So yeah, we've made similar, sort of land use recommendations in that way. But yeah, I mean, anything that you can recommend on how to, increase green space in urban areas. Just like you said, it doesn't have to be just trees. Right? We focused on trees because that's what we can actually measure and calculate from, with our current data. But yeah, just greening urban spaces in general, we want to do that. So feel free to recommend that.
Yeah, and I would also say, if this is something you're really interested in digging into and thinking about how to incorporate in your recommendations, we might want to consider bringing the Governor's Office of Planning and Research to the table as the state's long-range planning entity, and the entity that works on the general plan guidelines and so many other things, 375 and stuff like that. So keep that in mind. They also have a lot of good stuff on their site too, but that's a request you can make of us too. If you really want to dig into this, we can invite them to a meeting to talk through some of their work and how to align it with any of your recommendations.
One of the things in today's conversation, quite a few requests or suggestions around expert speakers have come in, and we'll touch base more on this close. We're talking about next steps, but a number of these are going to need to fold into the next calendar year in all probability, just given the time available for this phase one portion of our work, and the fact that we have currently 2 more meetings scheduled that we have on the agenda. We'll talk about whether or not we may want to do something in September, just given the pace that we need to pick up here, which I have every confidence that we will do in terms of our recommendations, but not like that. Matt, and being conscious that in just a couple of minutes, turning over to public comment.
Well, she kind of scooped on the idea of getting planning and research, because when you're talking about how do you tell a city not to grow, a bunch of our cities are totally empty on the inside, right? They're like they're gutted. So maybe there could be a metric like Lodi doesn't have a hole in the middle of it, but Stockton does. So if your city like Los Angeles has 49 square miles of abandoned lots, you don't get to grow out anymore. You have to focus on infill. And then I just wanted to comment, Carrie, on the water thing. I know I've been hearing from native plant aficionados for a long time that trees and parks in our communities don't deserve water, and I'm going to continue to forcefully push back on that, because water for people is what is resilience, and they make humans more resilient, and people are dangerous when they're not resilient. So pouring water on trees in South Stockton, where I have 1942 and 1936 sidewalks, will absolutely keep people alive, and that will ultimately, bodies let off carbon too when hundreds of them die in heat waves, and that there's just so much more to this climate risk than this cross of carbon that they're going to continue to crucify us on. And so we really need planning and research to come in here to talk to us about getting creative about short-lived climate pollutants and human behavioral interventions as they relate to carbon.
One of the key things that, Matt and others keep raising is that we are looking at a broader suite of greenhouse gases. And so whether it's nitrous, the nitrogen issues, phosphorus issues, the broader suite of linked greenhouse gases associated with carbon, but not limited to carbon. And that we're looking very clearly at climate impacts, again, not just quantitative carbon, although quantitative carbon for some of us is easier than others. Just because we know more about it to some degree. With that, I'm going to suggest that we actually expand public comment unless there's any by 3 minutes. Okay.
I teach a class called Trees in Society, and the more trees you have in the community, the lower the crime rate.
Yes. The higher the SAT scores, the lower the hospitalization stay times are. We can walk through those.
But importantly, the SAT doesn't exist. We got rid of the SAT. SAT was a racist test. We got rid of it. Think that putting that out of existence.
I'm just saying that, research on it should.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's the thing that we take for granted in the first world, and we drive around and we get to see beautiful places that aren't scary and uncomfortable. And then when it's time for me to plant trees in the neighborhood, the state has very little credence for the job creation or the mental health benefits of revitalizing that community. But we have tons of credence for 100 million metric ton piles of wood pellets in Stockton, or, pipes that don't leak with supercritical CO2 in them. So, I mean, there's really like a double standard when it comes to believing in people and places or believing in engineered solutions that would love to talk with OPR more about.
I can see there's going to be a waiting list of OPR speakers volunteering to come forward.
I'd say too, just really quickly that like at least when back to we initiated this conversation about the scoping plan, we ended up on a approved plan that includes like a 200% increase in investment in urban forestry, and I don't think we heard really any opposition. Right, we went through and there wasn't really any concern either, on like the carbon storage side, the co-benefit side, from the state agency side. I think the only question was how are you to be able to pay.
I think that's one of the things that's just going back to what the committee said it would do is, there are a number of really good recommendations that are in the scoping plan. This is not we want to acknowledge that in step one. But where we're charged with is, are there things that aren't in the scoping plan? Are there places where we want to say, atta girl, atta boy, atta everybody, atta they? So that is something that where we're coming from. And so, yes, Matt has a good way of bringing things forward around this, and all of our attention should be acknowledging, but we also want to acknowledge that urban tree planting gets 5 stars every time. And so that's implementation is the next step. To public comment to open this up, and E2 or 2B, who was in the queue. I hope that you have hung in there and are willing to.
Yeah, that's Wendy.
We have an order here. Sorry, I can't.
Okay.
I'm going to fail my vision test.
We can read it out.
Okay, thank you. Number 1. I can see number 1.
That's Wendy. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, this is Wendy Silver. I'm a professor of ecosystem ecology and biogeochemistry at Berkeley. And I just wanted to make a couple of quick comments. One is just so you know, the audio is a little rough, so it's hard to pick it all up. So I apologize if I missed any statements that are relevant to my comment. One is that I think it would be really important to think about grasslands in terms of rangelands and as a cross-cutting area. And I know this was briefly discussed with regard to oak woodlands, but many ranchers and in many ways, these ecosystems cover a wide range of classes. They could be shrublands or grasslands or oak woodlands, and often the management is similar. So from a climate change perspective, both resilience and mitigation, it would be valuable to think about these in a similar context. And then secondly, and that raises the land area. And I just cite something that came out of Davis that had 56 million acres of rangeland in the state. So that changes, I think, the equation quite significantly when you look at ways in which they might be managed for carbon sequestration, because even low rates of carbon sequestration over large land areas can have a really significant impact. And then I secondly just encourage you to use the literature, that there's quite a bit of research in the peer-reviewed literature out there about ways in which carbon can be sequestered in grasslands. The fact that it appears to be relatively persistent, although I think that the jury is still out on that there are some approaches that can be used that don't lead to an increase in invasive species, and that there's a lot of co-benefits associated with increasing soil organic matter content. And so I just strongly encourage you to use the literature, both the literature from California, but the broader literature as well, that relate to annual grasslands that could be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very helpful and appreciated. And the issues of, shall we say, amount and area combined are ones that we have to keep a good track on. The next name with number 2,
Susie.
Last name is Boyd.
Yeah. Go ahead, Susie.
Hi all. I am representing the Inland Desert Working Group's subgroup, the Carbon Sequestration Task Group, and we are a small group of desert experts and scientists. And so I'm going to speak to the piece on the desert sector. I have a few points I'd like to make, and I'll try to be quick about them. One is that it's more helpful to think of desert lands in terms of disturbed versus undisturbed rather than agriculture versus non-agriculture. In our world, you rarely hear the agriculture piece brought up, but our language is mostly around disturbed versus undisturbed. The second point I'd like to make is regarding the geochemistry. The process may be unstable, but the carbon storage is not unstable. In fact, it's extremely stable, and once it's underground, and that is where most of the carbon storage takes place. The third point I'd like to make is that this inorganic versus organic carbon piece is extremely important in the desert, playing a role in carbon sequestration accounting, because much of our carbon sequestration is in the form of inorganic carbon. And so that needs to be a piece of the language and when we speak about it. The other point I'd like to make is that it was mentioned that carbon sequestration is assumed in the desert is assumed to be low because of low productivity and low biomass. And what I'd really like the panel and all members of this group to understand is that the process for carbon sequestration in the desert is completely different than that of forests, which I have a graduate degree in, and that of grasslands or other types of ecosystems. Most of our carbon storage takes place underground. So when you look at a desert scenario and see low levels, low densities of plant biomass above ground, that is a very poor reflection of the potential for carbon sequestration because it's primarily taking place underground. So having said that, just really quick, one other thing is that there are other means of carbon sequestration in the desert that have been documented, especially internationally. One is that much carbon, in fact, underground carbon storage in closed aquifers has been reportedly one of the missing carbon sinks. So that needs to be considered, as well as just the process of shifting sand on balance. The carbon storage counts in a positive vein for sand shifting. So the bottom line is, I think it would be really helpful if our subgroup would be able to hold a meeting with the desert sector EAC so that we can start helping with educating and providing the background and experience we have and gain a better understanding of how this carbon sequestration process in the desert is so completely different. It's going to take a different perspective and lens to look at it and understand it. And then you can see how important the desert is in terms of meeting our climate change goals and how much the desert is capable of contributing to carbon sequestration. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you. Terrifically interesting. Do we have other people in the queue?
No, anyone else want to make a public comment?
Chelsea, since you were in the, did you want to make any comments? She hang on.
Hi all. Yeah, if I can you hear me?
Yeah, yes,
we can hear you.
Okay. Oh, awesome. Yeah. Well, I guess thanks for the opportunity to chime in, Lori. I don't think I actually have much to add in terms of the progress that we made in the ad hoc working groups I was involved with. My background is in grasslands, in particular rangelands specifically, and I could talk about that all day long. I think I'm really excited. We've been working really hard at Point Blue to close knowledge gaps around mitigation potential of grassland stewardship action. So I'll just, add to what Will said, in that I'm looking forward to pulling in that information to help guide our recommendations that come out of the grasslands group. And I look forward to continuing to hear from stakeholders and dive into the work with the rest of the committee as we move forward. So thank you.
Thank you. And Chelsea, thank you for also chiming in with regard to deserts where you're listed as well, because I think your willingness to help in that area will also be appreciated. So, are there any public comments in the room? I know there's only one of you left.
Two of us. But yeah, no comments.
That actually brings us to a break. So if we could all take a 15-minute break and be back here, that would bring us a little early in for Sylvia, but perhaps we can get Sylvia to speak a little earlier, and then she'd be willing to be let go a little earlier, given that it's 3 hours later for her. Everybody good with that? Thank you all. We'll be back in 15. Everybody know what bathrooms are, just so you do. Bathrooms, and they all have a code, but much less.
No, that's hard to say.
Only for the women. The women side the code. There is a new face on the screen. I don't know, Sylvia. Is Sylvia with us?
I'm right here.
That is the new face that I identified here. Perfect. This is a super interesting part of our agenda here is to hear from a couple of experts in areas that we want to deepen our knowledge in. The first of which is Sylvia Truce from the New Charitable Trust. Grateful to you for joining us. And we have 45 minutes for our segment with you, both presentation and discussion, and then we'll have 45 minutes with our friends from the Carbon Cycle Institute following that. So, Sylvia, would you like to share some of your experience and thinking with us?
Sure thing. Happy to do so. And thank you for running the slides. I was all prepared to share my screen. So yeah, thanks again. My name is Sylvia Truce. I work with the Pew Charitable Trust, and I'm calling in today from right outside of Washington, D.C., where I'm based. But California is my home state, so feel really grateful to be able to share some perspectives with you on incorporating coastal wetlands into your climate planning efforts. Next slide. So just a little bit of background about the Pew Charitable Trust. We were founded in 1948. We were originally a grant-making foundation, but in the early 2000s, we became a public charity. We are a nonpartisan organization, and we focus on advancing data and policy to promote sound public policy and to invigorate civic life. We engage in a lot of issues around three major areas. Government performance, which has a lot of focus on state issues as well, public health issues, as well as environment, which is a part of Pew that I work in. And our environment projects span both international and domestic lines of work. And on the slide there, you can see some descriptions of our work. But with respect to coastal wetlands and coastal blue carbon, we have two projects of relevance. One is an international project where we're working with countries to include protection and restoration of coastal wetlands in their climate commitments under the Paris Treaty. And we have a somewhat analogous effort working with states to incorporate coastal wetlands into their climate mitigation plans. Next slide, please. So always good to start with the definition. What is blue carbon? I've had people ask if blue carbon is offshore wind. So blue carbon really refers to the carbon that is sequestered and stored in coastal and ocean ecosystems. And there's coastal blue carbon, which refers to coastal vegetated habitats. And there's also oceanic carbon, which refers to the carbon that can be sequestered and stored in things like kelp or the seabed. I'll note that oceanic carbon is kind of a hot topic right now, a lot of research and private sector interest, but from actionable perspective in the climate mitigation policy arena, I don't think we're quite there yet on the marine side, but it is fast growing. Next slide. So coastal wetlands have been recognized for their climate mitigation contribution by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. As John alluded to earlier, they are incredibly efficient at capturing and storing carbon, in some instances at per acre rates exceeding those of forests. And if left undisturbed, this carbon, which is mainly stored in the sediments, can keep accumulating for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Since 2017, the EPA has included coastal wetlands in its national inventory of greenhouse gas emissions and sinks, and using IPCC methodologies. And so there's really a foundation right now that can be leveraged to incorporate coastal blue carbon habitats into natural working land strategies. And as mentioned in previous discussions, incorporating blue carbon will bring a lot of co-benefits as well related to water quality, shoreline protection, flood mitigation, biodiversity, support for commercial and recreational fisheries, tourism, and culture. Next slide. So in terms of California's coastal blue carbon habitats, I'm sorry that the formatting got a little messed up there. There's about approximately 75,000 acres of coastal blue carbon habitats in California, and that includes the Delta wetlands. And so these habitats are tidally influenced wetlands like marsh, scrub, shrub, which are woody wetlands, forested wetlands, mudflats, and seagrass. And in California, the major seagrass, the native species is eelgrass. I'll note, echoing what I heard earlier from other landscape types, mapping is a big challenge, and there's a need for finer scale mapping as well as repeatable mapping. The next slide. So as far as I'm aware, there has not been a comprehensive statewide assessment of current and potential blue carbon resources, but there has been a lot of research, particularly in regions like San Francisco Bay. The slide here has some estimates from some research that Pew supported, and John mentioned earlier, for example, the San Francisco Estuary Institute report. And so there are numbers here related to sequestration estimates, carbon stocks, and mitigation potential. I'll flag on this slide because I realize there's a lot of numbers here. The research we supported to develop a greenhouse gas inventory of San Francisco Bay estuaries, coastal wetlands, and that included portions of the Delta that showed that these wetlands are a net carbon sink. And what really struck me in this study was how these sequestration rates increased between 1990 and 2020 significantly. And I think you can attribute that to the significant amount of resources that have been going into the bay to restore the wetlands there. So next slide. So here are just a few slides that some California-based blue carbon researchers sent me just to provide some examples of estimates in terms of carbon stocks and mitigation potentials. This one is from a West Coast-wide database that is curated by Chris Janicek, who works for the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group. So these aren't California-specific numbers, but West Coast-wide, but there's still some interesting data here. You'll see like tidal swamps in particular store significant amounts of carbon per hectare, and actually mudflats as well. Next slide. Just flagging some additional mapping and research about blue carbon potential. This is a slide that was provided to me from Jim Holmquist, who's based in California but works for the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. And he has done work on mapping areas that are impounded from tidal flow and estimating the greenhouse gas mitigation impacts of restoring tidal flow to these areas, which could be quite significant. Next slide. So when thinking about implementation targets for coastal blue carbon, it's important to think about the scale of loss of these habitats. 90% of all of California's wetlands have been diked and drained, and this largely happened over the last 100, 150 years for conversion to agricultural uses. Some recent estimates of coastal wetland loss were developed by a paper in Brophy et al., where they estimated historic estuary extent and found that estuaries historically extended further, much further than they do now. And that report had estimates for California in terms of coastal wetlands at about 82% loss. And you'll see on the map here that the study actually breaks down by region. I'll note that the study indicates that the numbers for Southern California are quite likely significant underestimates. The constraints in the mapping approach that they used results in that number. So I think the takeaway here is, one, losses of wetlands equals losses of carbon in addition to all the other co-benefits these habitats provide. And two, when thinking about implementation targets, protect all remaining coastal wetland habitats and restore where feasible. Next slide. So fortunately, California is no longer draining its coastal large amounts of wetlands, and there are strict regulations in place. The regulatory framework for wetlands is the no net loss policy. But despite those strict regulations and this no net loss policy, there's still a lot of pressure to develop these coastal wetlands. And it's important to note that California's no net loss policy lacks a tracking system, meaning that, as someone described it to me once, estuaries suffer from the death by 1,000 cuts because you have project by project impacts that are occurring, and there is a lack of assessment of the cumulative impacts of these individual permits that can lead to loss. In addition to losses that may occur through land use, there's also the existential threat. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that's posed by sea level rise, absent action now. A study that was released in 2018 that some of you may recall by USGS predicted that under high sea level rise scenarios by 2100, all of California's tidal marsh would disappear absent intervention. So again, losses of wetlands results in losses of carbon as well as other co-benefits. So I'll add a third perspective when thinking about implementation targets: protect everywhere, restore where feasible, and think about maintaining beyond 2045 through resilience interventions that really need to happen now. Next slide. So when thinking about implementation targets, I think along policy lines because I'm a policy person, and thinking along these kind of three areas: protection, restoration, and building resilience. So in terms of protection, California's 30 by 30 initiative is a huge opportunity to really prioritize the protection of coastal wetlands. And I'll note in particular for seagrasses, this is very important because seagrass restoration can be notoriously difficult. So really protecting those remaining habitats is important. In addition, as I noted, the issues with tracking no net loss. So some considerations the committee could think about would be recommending better tracking of no net loss, and actually thinking about moving from no net loss to either a no net loss of ecological function, or even better, from my perspective, net ecological gain. And Washington State right now is looking at moving from no net loss to net ecological gain. I'll also note, again, in terms of protection, that federal infrastructure dollars, as unprecedented amounts of federal funding are available that can help incentivize protections for private land. So when thinking about restoration, there are some significant restoration planning and implementation efforts underway in the state, and also efforts to remove barriers. So kind of supporting that, for example, cutting the green tape initiative. But I'd also add that restoration efforts tend to cluster around, the San Francisco Bay Area and the Southern California area, and it would be beneficial to look at other areas that may be less represented. So for example, the North Coast. In terms of restoration, the slide that Jim Holmquist provided me kind of noted about the significant greenhouse gas benefit on a per acre basis that restoring tidal flows could bring. And finally, noting that restoration, coastal wetland restoration, can bring new value to ag lands that may be facing a loss of productivity due to issues like sea level rise. Finally, thinking about building resilience, really thinking about leveraging work of the committee in the climate mitigation space with climate adaptation efforts at the regional and state and even federal level. In addition, 30 by 30 and infrastructure, federal infrastructure monies can help with this. So I have here kind of three major recommendations in this space. I'm sure there are more, but really protecting those areas that will be the coastal wetlands of the future. The Nature Conservancy and the Coastal Conservancy a few years ago released a report called Hope for the Coast, where they mapped areas that currently aren't developed that could the migration zones if protective measures are put in now. So I would encourage taking a look at that report. There's also kind of the linkage with the built environment. Are there opportunities to remove barriers for habitat migration with roads and train tracks? And this would have would dovetail with adaptation efforts, because there are situations where roads and sea level rise that something's going to have to happen to move this infrastructure away. So the Highway 1 near Moss Landing is an example of thinking that they're doing, because that road will flood under sea level rise. And finally, I would note the issue of sediment starvation. And so this refers to wetlands that aren't receiving enough sediment to keep pace with sea level rise. And this is a significant issue in California. And so some of the interventions you could think about to address this are restoring water and sediment flows, for example, updating culverts, as well as what's known as the beneficial use of dredge. And so this refers to using dredge sediments for coastal wetland restoration projects. And I'll flag that NOAA and Army Corps right now are doing research on the East Coast with some beneficial use of dredge projects, looking at the blue carbon impacts of that, and that research is taking place over the next couple of years. So that will be an interesting study to keep an eye on. So next slide. So again, wanted to flag the paper that John mentioned, the San Francisco Estuary Institute paper that pulls together existing mapping data, existing data on sequestration rates, and provided some estimates for consideration in terms of incorporating coastal wetlands into the climate mitigation strategies like the scoping plan. This paper also provides recommendations related to resilience benefits as well as recommendations for investing in the knowledge infrastructure needed to really move blue carbon into the climate policy arena. And the QR code there will take you to the paper. All right, next slide. So natural working land strategies for climate mitigation policy is a relatively new arena, and blue carbon is even more new relative to other landscape types like forests. So I thought it'd be helpful to provide a few examples from other states. Oregon is in the process of developing what they're calling activity metrics, which are similar to the implementation targets. And they're taking a two-tiered approach with recommended and emerging. And so of the recommended practices, many hit on what I just talked about in the previous slides. One other area that they're investing in is the development of a blue carbon calculator, where they can assess the climate mitigation benefits of investments in tidal wetland conservation and restoration. Going to the Gulf now, looking at Louisiana and their coastal master plan, which is quite likely one of the largest coastal restoration plans on the planet. They are interested in incorporating blue carbon as a metric in decision-making for projects under the coastal master plan. And in addition, they just got funding to do a statewide assessment quantifying and monitoring the carbon impact of restoration projects funded through the coastal master plan. So California could think about investing in a similar statewide monitoring system as well for coastal wetlands. Finally, going to the East Coast, New Jersey is in the process of developing natural working lands targets, and there's examples here of some of the practices that they're considering, including living shorelines, as well as marsh migration zones and tidal reconnection projects. Next slide, please. I think this is a great time for California to really leverage federal efforts in the natural working land space overall, but in particular coastal wetlands and coastal blue carbon, because there's a lot of interest at the federal level. Of course, as I mentioned, there's unprecedented amounts of funding available through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act that is dedicated to nature-based solutions. In addition, earlier this year, the Biden administration released its Ocean Climate Action Plan, which prioritizes a set of actions ranging from research to agency guidance to actual protection and restoration efforts that will be implemented between now and the end of 2024. So there's an opportunity for California really to position itself as a partner and a site for some of these activities to really take advantage of the federal resources that are available right now. Next slide. So I'll wrap up with just these final thoughts. Protection and restoration of coastal blue carbon habitats is a no-regret strategy from a climate mitigation standpoint. And even though relative to other landscape types, the mitigation impacts may be small, they are there, and you will also bring about many co-benefits, in particular with respect to adaptation and resilience. It's very important when thinking about implementation targets to think about the impacts of sea level rise, both in terms of the fate of carbon, what is happening to this carbon when wetlands convert to open water, because these carbon losses should be tracked as well. And in addition, what sort of strategies can be put in place to really manage these losses? So as someone once told me, a good adaptation strategy is a good carbon strategy. I'd also recommend investments in the knowledge infrastructure. There's a great need for finer scale mapping of coastal wetland extent, change over time data, so really repeat mapping, consistent and repeated mapping, and elevation data. As I noted before, investments to help the state track permitted impacts and how they're achieving, or to what extent they're achieving their no net loss goals. Site-specific data, so coastal carbon data, and particularly in underrepresented regions. There's a lot of great data in the Bay Area, but investing in more site-specific carbon data in areas like the North Coast. And again, investments in the modeling infrastructure. So I am talking right now about coastal wetlands and coastal blue carbon habitats, but there's obviously other wetlands besides coastal, and assessing the greenhouse gas mitigation role and impact of all of them should be a recommendation. These wetlands are one of the most endangered ecosystems on the planet. Development pressure continues, so really looking at other wetland types, and particularly from a protection standpoint, what role that could play. And so finally, with respect to marine carbon, California is fortunate to have a system of state marine protected areas as well as national marine sanctuaries. And these spatial protections could be leveraged to improve knowledge around oceanic carbon, for example, for things like kelp forest protection and restoration. So with that, next slide, I have my contact information if anyone wants to reach out to me. I'm happy to take any questions from the group.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. We have good 15 to 20 minutes, that 15 anyway, that we can give to discussion here. So, and then we'll be welcoming Tori and his colleagues on. With this, I'd like to do two things. One is first have committee questions, and then, although we have public comment later, if there's time, to also have public comment here now, because Sylvia will be leaving the meeting, and it would be the only opportunity for members of the public to pose questions to her directly. So we start with members of the committee. Any thoughts or questions?
Well, thank you, Sylvia. That was super informative. And one of my questions was going to be what are other states doing? But you highlighted that. You mentioned the carbon calculator in Oregon. Is that already available, or is that under development?
That's under development right now. And part of the information that they're using to develop that was a refined coastal wetland greenhouse gas inventory that they did in Oregon. And I think the tool should be finalized by the middle of next year, I believe, because a lot of the foundational information needed for that is in place or is being developed right now. And I'm happy to connect anyone with the folks involved in the calculator. And I'll note too that this is being done under the auspices of Oregon's Coastal Management Program and the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board.
Other committee observations or questions? I have a couple, if others do not. All right, I have a, so in New Jersey, of course, the coastal plain is so very different than what we have on the West Coast. So, you know, kind of exporting what New Jersey is doing here would be difficult, but what would be the counterpart that you would think of for California, given our situation?
Yes, that's why in terms of the actual numbers, I left it blank because I realize it is such a different system. But I do think some of the practices that they're, or implementation areas that they're contemplating could translate. For example, the one related to living shorelines, the one related to restoring tidal connections, protecting marsh migration zones, and really kind of strengthening the no net loss aspects of it as well too.
Yeah, as Matt has pointed out, in many areas we have good words, but our ability to implement is sometimes limited. The second thing is with regard to Mountain Meadows, actually California has done quite a bit of work there. There are two really solid partnerships. The Klamath Meadows Partnership is a little younger than the Sierra Meadows Partnership, but there's been a solid amount of state funding going into the restoration of mountain meadows. So I think that's an area where the state actually may have a little bit of a leadership edge compared to a number of other states in that regard. And I don't know how much you've been tracking that. It's not to say that we can't do more, we can, and we need to accelerate it, but it is also incorporated into our forest related work, since most of those mountain meadows are embedded within forest systems. And the suppression of fire and the historic timber industry desire to have more stems per acre have been challenging factors for that. If that can be addressed with that.
I just wonder on Mountain Meadows how much methane they're producing, or if there's much data on that. That's
Yeah.
all the freshwater wetlands. That's one of the challenges.
Yeah, and that's a really good question. The measurements that I'm familiar with, and these have been tracked through CAL FIRE in its investments through CCI, have not flagged that, but it may be because they were not measuring it. And that's one of the challenges with that. I guess you'd have to weigh that off with the flammability of all, for example, the white fir encroachment and the lack of hydrological capacity that happens when you have too many straws in the ground moving in. But that is an interesting, that's a good thing for us to spend a little time on. I mean, trees themselves emit methane.
Yeah.
So, if we really wanted to deal with it, we could put these little, they're really simple devices. You just screw them in the bark and then you just burn the methane out. So it's hard on the tree. I'm teasing slightly, but no, it is, there is that question of the interaction between the natural cycle around that and the accelerated cycle. Okay.
In the Southern Valley, we've seen a huge increase in percolation ponds this year because of the excess water.
The excess, the abundance.
Yeah. Well, it depends on your perspective, I suppose. What are those functionally? Are those a close analog to a vernal system, or is it just something different?
Do we have anybody with vernal pool expertise to answer that question?
I think they're pretty different. The water is percolating pretty quickly down. It's percolating down. The vernal pools there's a hard pan. There's hardly any deeper layer. But I think they're somewhat similar in that they're seasonally flooded.
I'll just add it. I was just going to add with respect to kind of the forest wetland interface, and this may not be an issue in California, but it's something we've seen in other states, is that in thinking about in terms of an inventory, that the forest inventory assessment will capture wetlands, coastal wetlands, and then other coastal wetland mapping also captures it. So you have an issue, well, one of double counting, and two, under the forest inventory assessment, they're often using the wrong emissions factors. So again, I don't know if that's an issue in California, but I know this kind of overlap and the issue of the proper emissions factor is an issue in other states, particularly those that are using FIA data.
Just checking, did you mean the FIA forest inventory analysis from the Forest Service?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
There has been some work, but maybe this is something that CNRA could update us on, of the Mountain Meadow inventory work. That's been something that's been ongoing for the past 15 years. We do know that there's been a tremendous constriction of the Mountain Meadow area. So the current day extent is far less than the natural extent. But that would be helpful just for folks to know. It's a little bit like coastal wetlands. There's a small area, but very important. It's important both for soil carbon and water storage, but it's also the upland and wetland relationship is people talk about doubling storage in the meadows, you can more than double the storage in the uplands as well. And so there's that interaction there from a water storage perspective and functionality. But there is an initial inventory. Don't know how current it is. That would be great. So it's a small amount of acres, but
Who's the leading?
it's run out of the Resources Agency.
Okay, I didn't know if it was like a division within resources.
My guess, if I had to guess, because I do not know, is that it would be Fish and Wildlife.
Okay.
Because they've been the lead with regard to wet meadows restoration and work, this relationship there for wildlife and fish. I'm sorry, I don't have a person.
I have a colleague who's been working on that, so I'll try.
Okay, great, thanks so much.
Are there any other comments from the committee, or shall we open it up to the public?
I just want to say hi to Sylvia and thank you for coming out and teaching us in California again. We've been doing this for a while. We'll listen to you one of these days. And I was wondering if, like, I worked in Richmond a lot of that was like NOAA fishery stuff. Like how much of the coastal wetlands does California even manage? Is how much of this is our turf versus the federal government's turf when you look at our preserve and restore space?
Yeah, NOAA Fisheries only has letter writing power. So if there's going to be, for example, a few years ago, there was a proposed expansion of an aquaculture facility in Humboldt Bay that would have impacted, I think Humboldt Bay has the largest remaining eelgrass, or maybe second largest remaining eelgrass beds in the state, Melissa would know. And so NOAA Fishery could weigh in and say this is essential fish habitat for salmon, but they really didn't have the power. Who had the power was the Coastal Commission. So yeah, I would say the states definitely hold, the state of California holds most of the power with respect to coastal wetland protection and restoration, as far as I'm aware.
Thanks. Yeah, I know NOAA barked at folks when we were spilling stuff out of the refinery into the North Bay there, because there's that eelgrass bed there. But thanks.
Yeah, they can be an important partner, of course, bringing in that fish habitat perspective. And NOAA Fisheries, their habitat office, they're another recipient of these federal infrastructure money. So they're investing a lot of money in habitat restoration now. So.
Thank you so very, very much. We really appreciate it. And I think these slides will be distributed, is that correct? And folks will have your contact information to follow up. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Can we do the public comment? Can we do the public comment?
I asked for public comment. We didn't have any, but we'll make a last call. I did ask.
All right, Jeff, go ahead.
To be, can you?
Yeah, it's Jeff, Okay.
Sorry, folks, I was unmuted. Implications of restoring beaver populations in California with respect to wetland carbon sequestration.
Okay, this is a question for Sylvia. She may have already departed.
No, I'm still here.
Did you want to respond to the question, which was relative to, are there implications of restoring beavers related to wetlands and carbon benefits?
There has been talk of this. I am not aware of any studies in California, but Melissa and John may know more. I mean, they are ecosystem engineers. They keep water in the landscape. I think the issue may be methane, but again, I would defer to John and Melissa if they have any thoughts on beavers.
There are enormous benefits to having beavers back in the landscape as a chief engineers of our hydrology, but I don't know if there's data per se.
I don't either. I'm more of a saline expert, and I haven't seen too many beavers in the eelgrass, but I imagine that there are certainly implications for the like system level hydrology that we just were discussing previously, that if there are any studies out there, we absolutely should be reading. So if anybody has tips and resources, send them our way.
I know they're enormously beneficial for serving as wildfire breaks and habitat refuges, enhancing groundwater storage and restoring basic fertility around the fundamental hyphic zone that extends out from there. But I don't know that there are direct studies on carbon to beaver ratios. But I don't know that we need that to know that they're good.
True.
Thank you.
Jeff, hand is still up, but I think we're going to move on at this juncture to ask Corey and Jeff and Jonathan to join us so that we have time for also some interaction and questions with them as well. Christy, you became a main speaker box.
Just hold on a second.
Adam thinks he's got a way to address that, but I go.
We'll take everybody we can get.
Is it better? I didn't do anything on my end.
We won't hold you responsible, but with this and with a lot of gratitude for Sylvia, Tori and Jeff and Jonathan have kindly agreed to speak with us today about their work in agricultural system. And so with that, and if everybody can just ignore the computer screen issues there, Tori, could we ask you to launch away?
Yes. Thank you. I really appreciate first and foremost, the work of the committee. Much appreciative of you all digging into the natural working land sector and continue to do your work, as well as the agencies. And thanks for the invite. My name is Tori Estrada. I'm with the Carbon Cycle Institute. I'm the executive director. Our mission is really focused on building the sort of local and regional capacity of the agricultural sector to plan, implement, you would say adaptively manage and scale agricultural climate solutions. We've been around since 2013, so we've been at this for a decade. So what I want to do to intro Jeff and John, and I'm happy to have both Jonathan and Jeff with us today to really engage the committee. So our presentation is going to be kind of in three main areas. We're first going to start out with a discussion of what is the biophysical potential for recarbonizing and building resilience in our California working landscapes, and some initial discussion of what that might look like, So Jeff Creek's going to lead that discussion. Just as background for folks on the committee that don't know Jeff, he's got a PhD in rangeland ecology. Jeff directs our rangeland and agro-ecosystem management work. And just as we get in the conversation, so you know who's in front of you, Jeff also leads our training and education program. So training folks in the field to be engaging producers in planning and implementing agricultural climate solutions, and also directs, of course, a lot of our on-farm planning and implementation work. Second piece of our presentation is going to be talking and thinking about what's possible to achieve in the agricultural sector by 2030, available information and data, what do we need to think about scale. I would say in addition to models and research, so the on-the-ground sort of logistics, and some of the key practitioners, leaders, and land managers in that conversation. Dr. Jonathan Wachter, who's also got a PhD in soil science. He's our lead soil scientist. He leads our science and data team and also works with a lot of our local partners developing strategies to scale up agricultural climate solutions. And then we'll end with some discussion around the types of policies, programs, financing, maybe in the EAC parlance, the pathways we should be considering. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as we conclude. So without further ado, we can advance the slide and I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Tori, and thanks to the committee. Really appreciate the difficult task you folks are facing. This slide from a piece by Shramsky and others in 2015, I think does a good job of illustrating a portion of the dilemma that we're facing that we don't often or always think about when we think about sequestering carbon. Our capacity to do that, of course, has been radically affected by our destruction of functional ecosystems globally. This is just a graph showing the decline in global phytomass over the last couple thousand years, and most precipitously over the last 100 or so years. That I think is something we really need to keep in mind when we think about the potentials for carbon sequestration on our working lands. Next slide, please. So this work, obviously the Keeling curve here, I'm sure we're all familiar with that. But Sanderman and others' work illustrates how much of that that excess CO2 in the atmosphere has been driven by losses of carbon from our working land soils. Upwards of a third of that excess CO2 in the atmosphere is a function of how we have managed, or should we say mismanaged, our working landscapes, and particularly our soils, I think. So the opportunity here is that we can recognize that it's really been the incremental daily actions by millions of farmers over a couple of centuries that have really driven this loss of carbon from our working land ecosystem. So it suggests that the opportunity, first of all, obviously agriculture has a huge impact on the atmosphere, but at the same time it suggests an enormous opportunity for a different approach to agriculture to have quite the opposite effect on atmospheric greenhouse gases. Next slide, please. So just a few quotes, but I think most importantly is recognizing that really as we look at opportunities for achieving negative emissions, enhancing soil carbon really is it as far as what we have as a functional strategy at the global scale with about 3.5 billion years of R&D behind it. And that's really our opportunity as we look at agriculture as a climate solution. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, 166 years of management of California landscape by European Americans has resulted in extreme losses of soil carbon. We're now looking at somewhere around 1% organic matter in much of our ostensibly productive agricultural soils in California. We do have some exceptions where we have high carbon soils, but for the most part, many cases what were former wetlands or seasonal wetlands and are now farmed or over-farmed, highly degraded soils, with, again, representing enormous carbon sink potential across the state. Next slide. Critical, I think, in both sort of the degradation of the state's soils, but also in terms of a greenhouse gas mitigation opportunity is the role of nitrogen in our agricultural ecosystems. It's pretty clear that the dominant driver of increasing atmospheric nitrous oxide is agriculture. The way we're feeding ourselves is also driving our biosphere to a crisis point. It's interesting to note, and this is from the California Nitrogen Assessment from 2016, that about 32% of the nitrous oxide emissions in California come from our ag soils and manures. I think it's also important when we think about co-benefits that reactive nitrogen equivalent to about 71% of the synthetic nitrogen applied to California croplands every year actually ends up in the state's groundwater, accounting for 88% of nitrogen input to the groundwater. So when we say that synthetic nitrogen is essential for agricultural production in California, I think it's really important that we keep this kind of information in mind. What is clear is that we are well beyond planetary boundaries for nitrogen, and that exceedance is driven by our intentional forcing of the global nitrogen cycle through the manufacture and use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. Next slide, please. Opportunities for recarbonizing the state are numerous, and I'll just touch on a couple. Of the 56 million acres of rangeland in California, and Dr. Silver mentioned this earlier on a comment, and this is work from Mayer and Silver from 2018. Just looking at just about 6% of California rangelands, applying compost at very modest rate, one time, could sequester very significant amounts of carbon in those grazed grassland ecosystems. Next slide, please. So, sort of a thought experiment for California croplands. This was done a few years ago, so assumed 9.8 million acres of irrigated cropland. I think we've lost a few in the intervening years. But just looking at the carbon in compost and what it would mean to add that to our soils at various rates. You can see the numbers, even at the lowest rate, at 3 tons of compost per acre, assuming a 25% carbon in that compost, would represent a very significant addition of carbon to our soils and a very significant amount of carbon dioxide transferred from the atmosphere through photosynthesis to the soils in the form of compost. In addition, there's a significant avoided methane opportunity as we divert organics from our landfills under 1383, and work by Harrison and others out of UC Merced has provided some estimates, quantitative estimates on the implications there. Next slide, please. So changing soil carbon content in our soils is actually quite straightforward. It can be done very quickly. This is an example out of Mendocino County. This is a vegetable grower who over the course of 4 years brought her soils up from about 1.4% to 6% soil organic matter. As Dr. Lawls pointed out, a positive carbon budget it simply involves increasing our input relative to our losses. This happened to involve several different practices: application of compost, introducing cover crops, and avoiding tillage to the extent possible. There are obviously a whole lot of questions around this, and I think particularly recent paper by Donarski and others gets into all of the things that we need to consider when we talk about increasing soil carbon, particularly in the plow layer and with soil amendments. Nevertheless, the opportunity is enormous, and we should certainly be looking at this as we think about our soils as a carbon sink in California. Next slide, please. So this has come up in today's meeting. I was delighted to hear it. Obviously, a huge opportunity in the restoration of what may have been over 12 million acres of oak woodlands that have been lost in the historical period in California. Obviously, enormous potential. Yes, there are challenges with reestablishing oaks, but again, as I think Matt has pointed out very nicely, it's a question of putting the resources to bear. And the idea of restoring, or at least including valley oaks in both our grazed rangeland systems and our cropland systems across the state represents a huge opportunity in carbon sequestration benefits. Next slide, please. Also, again, recent work by Chartis and others has shown a very significant impact of introducing hedgerows across California's agricultural lands. This is a very conservative estimate because they only looked at perimeters of croplands and of farmlands in California. So if you think about hedgerows being integrated within the boundaries of the farm system, we could multiply this number several fold. Importantly here, and I really hope folks will consider this, this work has been done in the past. We faced a similar crisis, although much lower in magnitude, in the 1930s, and we had a very profound and well-structured federal response to that crisis. We formed the Soil Conservation Service, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and created a partnership amongst the federal and state governments under the auspices of the resource conservation districts across the United States. And those institutions are all still very much in existence. They are horribly underfunded and not entirely functional in all cases today, but they exist. And so the opportunity is to engage those really, at one point, profoundly productive institutions in activities at scale that would actually drive a rapid and significant change in the condition of our working lands across California. And with that, I would turn this over to my colleague, Dr. Wachter, to talk about strategies for actually implementing this work on the ground. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Next slide, please. So here are some numbers demonstrating, this is some more recent precedent for the magnitude of implementation that Jeff was just demonstrating. So on the left, these are practices implemented through the NRCS EQIP program in California over the last 18 years. And these are just a few examples. But you can see, for example, 175,000 acres of riparian forest buffer planted, almost 2 million acres of prescribed grazing. And these are just EQIP numbers. Doesn't include CSP or CRP or other NRCS programs, which would increase these acreages quite a bit. On the right are some implementation numbers from the CDFA Healthy Soils program. This is a much younger program. It started in 2017. And it also doesn't include direct support for the sort of on-the-ground technical assistance that NRCS does through their local field offices. But nevertheless, you can see almost 100,000 acres of compost application have been funded and implemented, 10,000 acres of tillage reduction. So importantly, both of these programs are way oversubscribed. In other words, there's much greater demand among producers than we see in these numbers. And there's also far greater potential for scaling these practices, as Jeff was outlining. So later in this talk, Tori's going to talk about some of the strategic supports that we need to start scaling up and actually meeting some of that potential. Next slide, please. Another indicator of demand is on-the-ground conservation planning. So there's an image of a carbon farm plan on the right as an example. Carbon farm plans are whole farm conservation plans. that are centered around identifying opportunities for sequestering carbon and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And these come out of a technical assistance provider, on the ground in the field, working very closely with the producer, identifying opportunities. And we at CCI work very closely with in supporting RCD staff and many other partners across the state in developing these plans. So to date, 200 carbon farm plans have been completed, covering almost 130,000 acres statewide. And together they outline potential for an estimated 2 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent benefit, both sequestration and reductions over 20 years. And until very recently, all of this work has been done without dedicated state or federal support. There recently carbon-centered or carbon-focused planning is getting more attention, for example, through CDFA's new conservation planning grant. Next slide, please. So next, I'm going to talk about some target setting and strategy development work that's happening at the local scale. So this work is being led by local agricultural conservation organizations like RCDs, or resource conservation districts. And this is really important because it's part of enabling real participation among the agricultural community, who often don't have a seat at the table in planning and strategy development discussions. It also allows for partnering with county staff, with ag commissioners' offices, Farm Bureau, and many other partners. And it also, doing this work also helps to build capacity at these local ag organizations, who are the ones that are actually providing the technical assistance and the project management work in supporting producers in executing these strategies. So this is a real community-driven process. It often starts with estimating biophysical potential for scaling climate beneficial practices. It's using field-based planning data, for example, those carbon farm plans I mentioned on the last slide, using geospatial data, implementation data from RCD offices, from NRCS offices. And it's really centered around engaging producers throughout the whole process, through workshops, focus groups, interviews. And this is one important part of this is building awareness and agency and ownership of these strategies among the ag community. Of course, producers are the land stewards who are ultimately looking after the land and will be implementing these practices. But also to really understand directly from those stewards the needs and barriers at the local level, to be able to inform measures and inform implementation targets. And the result of all this can be in developing measures and strategies or pathways, at a local level, developing implementation targets and countywide ag goals. And so on the left are photos from an example of this process happening in San Mateo County, just one example of many. And I'm gonna, on the next slide, I'll show some of the results of that process. Next slide. So this was, in this case, it was a very close partnership between the San Mateo Resource Conservation District and the County of San Mateo. And it was a part of the broader county climate action plan. So it was estimated that that the ag sector is responsible for about 7,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent emissions per year, or about 1.5% of the total county emissions. And again, through this kind of participatory process, they arrived at these goals. So by 2030, the goal of sequestering 7,900 metric tons of carbon dioxide per year, and then scaling that up to 13,000 metric tons of CO2e per year by the year 2045. And another important important body of work coming out of this was developing these supporting measures. And I won't go through these in detail, but you can see these specific recommendations, and this is just a summary, but specific recommendations for increased funding and increased investment, specific recommendations around 1383 and compost procurement and utilization, specific recommendations for communications, for technical assistance support, scaling funding for technical assistance providers, for research and demonstration projects, etc. So with that, I will turn it over to Tori.
Thanks, Jonathan. If we go to the next slide. Yeah, so what Jonathan was just talking about in terms of some of the, I would say, county level work where we're actually thinking similar to, I think, the EAC in the state around implementation target setting and some of the strategies and pathways. CCI currently is working with a number of partners in the Bay Area and the SAC region doing very similar work at a county scale. And just to mention, we have organized RCDs in 39 counties into 7 regional hubs across the California, and we're beginning in 5 other regions to undertake this level of assessment of not only the biophysical potential for scaling up climate smart agricultural practice, not only for carbon sequestration, but for the myriad of other ecosystem services. But probably as importantly, to start to identify some of the critical opportunities, barriers, pathways. And I think all that's really pointed at trying to bring some local level data and information to the conversation that is happening at a regional and state level. And so just to summarize a little bit, some of the key information, that we've been looking at, so definitely think it's important to acknowledge and understand the level of existing planning and conservation work that's happening on the ground. Because in some way that's going to be our long-term demand. So when people talk about feasibility and interest of producers, I think the conservation planning is a good metric to think about the sort of not only the potential, but the demand that's coming before us. We've been looking very critically at a local scale around levels of practice and project implementation using some of our state level data and conversations with producers. So this is another area I'm sure the EAC is looking at, but we're really interested in sort of mining a deep level of data around sort of what is the level of current adoption and interest in implementing these programs at scale. Obviously, looking at and having discussions around the opportunities and barriers to implementation. So that's embedded in some of the discussion we had around that Jonathan talked about in terms of scenario development. So the things that sort of come up, and this is not the laundry list, but the availability of technical assistance and sort of institutional capacity for sharing amongst land managers about what's working and not working. Certainly looking deeply, and this has been the interesting conversation with counties and commodity groups, is around understanding the economics, particularly the significant upfront cost of some of this work. So we're getting into deep conversations and trying to understand the economics of this in a sector that I think there are emergent market signals that would, provide support for this type of management. Obviously, been talked about at EAC in our discussions. There are infrastructure opportunities and constraints. We talk about compost. There are definitely constraints there. But the point is trying to really raise up and develop local level data that can be aggregated to not only inform local programs, but regional and state programs. And I think there's also an opportunity in those conversations to center the voices and issues of justice and equity in that. Next slide. So just to be clear, CCI is working with a number of other partners, including CalCan, currently right now, and developing recommendations on priority actions and strategies for the rangeland and the ag sector that we will be sharing with the EAC. We're looking at a number of priority actions and strategies, from the practice level, compost application, hedgerow establishment and a mixture of those, but also, as you folks talked about today, is like, could we start to, in our conversations, focus on near-term actions and strategies, like in the next 5 years that are sort of no regrets, may have high level of feasibility and impact. Some of the key pathways, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, that we're looking at, is trying to think about sort of where are there opportunities, particularly in the ag sector, to leverage scale. So one conversation I think it's been underrepresented is sort of how do we continue to leverage the USDA investments, which are significant at this point. And so what role should the federal government play in implementation? What's the state level's role in implementation? But there are other investments we need in terms of R&D, research, and infrastructure. So trying to figure out how we can sort of meld the different investments together to really scale up this work. And I will mention that there is actually a growing support of local and regional governments. We have many examples of local and county government actually putting forth investments and supporting this work on the ground that's not, I don't think, well represented in a lot of our state level discussions. Obviously, we're obviously focused on capacity building, so we're trying to really be clear about the workforce that would be needed to scale this up and the technical assistance. There are a number of existing platforms and conversations, current MOU being discussed between federal and state agencies about scaling up this kind of assistance to land managers, ongoing. So that's another source of information. California Association of Resource Conservation, for example, actually has an ag technical assistance task force that's actually identifying gaps and weaknesses and opportunities to scale up technical assistance across the state, and also a number of training programs that actually could be scaled up. We're obviously talking about the infrastructure, not only compost, but plant material, equipment. All those are sort of robust discussions at the local level. And I guess one thing we would recommend that's sort of already organically happening but could use support is the regionalization of this kind of conversation and planning and implementation. So thinking about innovation and implementation hubs, not only for sort of refining implementation and planning at local level, but being able to bring critical information to conversations like the EAC is having and maybe our upcoming scoping plan, is where we can get local level data and perspectives from growers more integrated into the process. Next slide. So, so we are working, and we'll share tomorrow, we're working on what we're calling a 1.0 version of recommendations for the EAC that we're going to share with you all tomorrow. A larger ag working group that includes some EAC members is going to be developing some ag recommendations I'm expecting in mid to late August that will identify a number of critical actions and pathways. And I think the thought is that we would finalize those before the September 15th EAC deadline. So just to know, similar to you, we're in process on some of this conversation, but our intent is to share our recommendations, our resources, research, and try to collate that and share that with the EAC members as a way to sort of move the work forward. So yeah, that's it. And happy to take questions or have a discussion.
Thank you so much. Wonderful overview of your work and thinking and recommendations there. I'd like to first open it up to members of the committee for any observations or questions.
I'll just come out and say that, Tori, you can have my seat anytime you want, bud. You know more about this stuff than I do, and thank you for coming in and schooling us. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
So, Tori, this is Will Horvath from UC Davis. I'm just wondering, so most of this is based on modeling output, right?
Can you get rid of the slide so that we could see people a little bit better?
Most of your results based on model outputs?
Maybe you could be more specific. Are you talking about just part of the presentation about the
What's
potential.
your potential to sequester carbon across the landscape?
Jeff, you want to take it?
Yeah, I think that's largely true, Will. Of course, some of this is based on field data. Chartist et al.'s work is direct measurement from soils under hedgerows in Yolo County. So it's I would say a mix of both field data and modeling. Yeah.
So if your potential sometimes would estimate more than a megagram of carbon per hectare per year.
I'm sorry, your mic is breaking up. Will you repeat that?
Some of your numbers would suggest you have more than a megagram of carbon per hectare per year.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And
So,
some of those results did indeed show that.
Right. And so in our decadal studies that we have completed in California, the max we can get over 30 years is 0.3 megagrams of carbon per hectare using composts, no-till, cover crops. So I'm just wondering, so that would be the technical potential that we've demonstrated in sort of the research environment. And I would counter that the biophysical economic potential would be like 10 or 20% of that, of 0.3 megagrams.
Well, I think the framework that Jonathan and Tori outlined suggests that we haven't even begun to tap the potential of California's working landscapes because we haven't engaged producers at the scale or the level that would in fact achieve the kind of results that we think are possible.
Yeah.
It's just because, you know, we could say compost is a good thing, and it is, and I agree. But we can't produce enough compost to apply to more than 5 to 10% of the land.
Right, right. That's where we are now. I think as we build, and I'm speaking as someone who's done this work on the ground for 35 years. As we build carbon within our working land systems, we increase the potential of those systems to actually capture carbon and produce compost, if that's one of our objectives, of course. So we're looking at a pretty highly degraded California landscape at this point. We've got 166 years of basically abuse. I think the Shramsky work shows that we've lost enormous photosynthetic potential, certainly globally and certainly across California. And the challenge facing us now is will we actually put the resources forward to recapture that potential? So I don't disagree with your points, but I think they're in the context of what we have. And the question is, how will we change this going forward? What can be done to reverse these trends?
Christine?
Thanks. Both these presentations have just been fabulous. The one before you guys and then this one too. Really appreciate the information. And I just wanted to just comment how much what I've heard over and over and over again today from even the committees is this idea of in some we will be able to and others not yet, but looking at regional solutions. And I really appreciate the approach here to work through RCDs and trusted partners at the scale that is going to work, that is going to address, I think, a lot of the issues that Matt has brought up about sort of industrial scale and moving vines from one place to burn them in another place, and which we really don't want. So I just really appreciate the focus on what the opportunities are, but looking at strategies that can be applied locally through trusted brokers with the communities that can identify what will work and won't result in these crazy agro-industrial solutions that when we look at them in retrospect, we're like, wow, why are we doing that? Why are we, trucking compost around or burning things in one place or another? So that was super long-winded, but just I appreciate the approach.
Your observations, Nathaniel?
I have a question, Jeff, about the soil organic matter estimates. You mentioned 1%. What are our current thoughts about past soil organic matter contents, and are you going to make a recommendation about some target croplands arrangement?
Good question. I have no data on historical carbon levels in California soils. I do know that much of the Central Valley was seasonal wetland before we drained it for agriculture, and we can speculate what the carbon content in those systems might have been. I think we can assume they were much higher than we have today following 160 years of intensive cultivation with very limited organic inputs into those systems over time. We may make a recommendation. I'd like to challenge the state to increase soil organic matter in the Central Valley by 1% by 2030. But that's my personal goal for the state. So we'll have to see what comes out of our recommendations. I'm not quite sure how we're gonna present that.
I guess the other thing I would say is, and I think what we're pointing to also in the local work that we're launching is, I feel like, much like other climate sectors, we need to engage actual practitioners on the ground in identifying what they can do. And I know we're early on in that, but I feel like that's, if we want to answer this question around scale, we actually need to ask folks on the ground what they're willing to do. And we could share numerous examples of where we've done this on a shoestring. But we are engaging producers, and producers are willing to engage. And it would be interesting to think about that level of decentralized action that actually had the support of R&D, so we can actually understand what's working. What are the levels of soil carbon? So I agree that we should know and make smart investments around soil carbon. But frankly, we need more data, but it shouldn't stop us from taking action. I think we can do both. I think we could take action. We can also enhance our ability to do the R&D and understand where investment should go, and we can learn over time. I guess what I get a little frustrated is that a priori we're saying we can't do it, and we don't even know what the levels are. And so I know it's a leap of faith, but I guess that's our presentation to you, is that we actually are trying to flip this on its head a little bit. It's sort of saying we need to be constrained about like what we know, but we also can open up the opportunity for people who are already taking pretty enormous action to go down this road. And the question is, how could we support them to scale that work, to learn, then to make better decisions? I think this is I would imagine we would say is a strong pathway to think about, is to build the learning and the research and evaluation part of this, so we actually know for certain what we can do and what the impact is beyond and including soil carbon, but will be beyond just soil carbon. It'll be resilience and, as Will said, ecosystem services. So that's the reality on the ground that we're trying to engage and bring into this process to the best we can.
Matt, you had your Will had his hand up, and Matt, you had yours. I don't know, you should down.
Corey said, I was just going to say that, these ranchers are willing to get creative. They all sent their kids to Davis. They all know it's not working. If you want to see how much faith they have, they're using their third, fourth generation estates to catch cow farts and dairy digesters. They don't want to do that. They're spreading liquid manure all over the place for no reason, but they're trying, right? And the state just led them in a super, boring, one-dimensional, top-down capitalist direction. And so generative solutions and applied research and people, leadership is bold. It's not saying what's easy and what's convenient.
Well, as far as the history of soil carbon in California and agriculture, for the water projects, there wasn't that much ag. And a study by DeClercq and Singer, former member of my department, used soil samples, from the 1930s or in the 40s, when the soil scientists at the University of California knew that these atom bombs were going to be exploded, so they wanted to get a baseline soil sample. And it showed that basically agriculture has increased soil carbon compared to sort of the before agriculture. And that was because it was assumed because irrigation, which is now possible through the state water projects, increased the productivity of the land through agriculture. And so more carbon was being put in the soil. So it slightly increased carbon over time, even more so in the perennial crops over time, over those 60 years. So I would argue that maybe we haven't lost that much carbon in these valley swells. And so, yeah, just look up the Clerk and Singer and you can find it.
No, I've seen that paper, Will. Thank you. And it's a good point. And as I thought about that, it occurred to me, well, that is, 60, 70 years after the initiation of agriculture in California. So, and also sort of concurrent with the advent of the Soil Conservation Service. So, I'd love to have some soil samples from the 1880s and to compare. But I get your point, but I think that we're missing a lot of data there. And particularly in light of the fact that we know that the valley wetlands were in fact drained very early on. So, I think we don't have enough data to be able to say that we have more, at 1%, we've got more carbon in our soils now than we did 160 years ago.
Carrie, and then I think we're going to need to bring this section to a close just so that we're able to excuse people at 5 when we've told them they can all go home to their various destinations. So one more comment and then we'll open up for public comment and then we'll move to the next. There are no other committee observations, and this one's going to wait till later. Are there any questions or comments from the public at this juncture? Hey, that is a very expansive and interesting suite of things that you put in front of us. It's much appreciated. Recognizing that some of the very big numbers on acreages cut across a number of the different types that we're looking at here, and that very clear focus on those drained valley soils as potentially the greatest potential in the near term is really super helpful. I thank you so much for taking the time to come in virtually.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Talk with us. And I know that there'll be some follow-up that happens as well. Your slides will also be distributed. And so folks will have your contact. Of course, we'll be looking for the recommendation that you sent our way. Thank you so much, Tori. Jeff and John.
Thank
you. Matt, do you have a question before we move to our?
Just had a wrap-up comment before we move to public comment, since I didn't see any, which is, in 1943, it took 18 months to build a Liberty ship. And in 1943, it took 3 days, and people built it and never knew how to build a ship. That's because people moved heaven and earth and brought together resources and dropped their baggage about who was qualified to do work, right? We let women and people of color get into skilled labor, and that's how we smashed the Nazis and the Japanese army. And we're in that same existential threat. And the good news is we have more smart people, because people back then were awful, and we have more resources too. So we can rally these troops and we can do big things and we can save people's lives. But if we continue to do this within the framework of like what UC's comfortable researching and what, state agencies won't get in trouble with their a lot of these agencies are captured. We're going to continue to soft pedal this, and we're going to continue to cook on sidewalks that were poured in 1942. So I want to thank Carbon Cycle for coming in and looking around the corner for us.
All right. Well, we definitely want the same degree of input and effort as we had with the Dust Bowl and we had with World War II and we had with World War I. It's perhaps even more existential than at those times. So, well said. With that, why don't we move to the next piece of the agenda, which is our next steps and agendas here. I think one of our biggest questions is, do we want to have a September meeting? And I raise this because when we look at our August 22nd meeting, I think that several groups will be able to move to making initial recommendations. Other groups are going to be at fairly final-ish recommendations because they're farther along now. Does the group feel that we need a September meeting or not? Because this is really the time where we either say yay or nay. Did I get any input on that? I'm gonna do this way. I'm gonna look at each of you and say, what's your vote? Nathaniel?
No.
Right, so you're leaning to the no. Carrie?
I believe that yes, it's the only opportunity we have to identify our cross-cutting issues as a team. And like really talk it out in the committee.
Why don't we go to the screen? I think I've got Melissa, Laura, Christy, and Matt from the committee. Can you guys give your sense?
I feel like we could have one if we all did our homework before then. Its necessity is contingent on us being on the hook because I can see, I agree. I'm sorry, I don't know who said that, the cross-cutting themes, but I agree that would be useful, but I think it is sort of predicated on us getting further in our individual goals. So whether that means that cross-cutting themes meeting happens in September or in October is maybe sort of what I'm wondering.
Well, we've identified some even in this meeting.
Yeah,
as
true.
cross-cutting themes. And I think if we can, so this would be a challenge to members of the committee coming into August and being ready to like deliberate on those and add to them, because we have identified at least 3 at this juncture. So that's, and recognizing that we're going to be slimming everything down to priorities and focus on that. If folks feel that they can come into August ready to do that, I think we could have identified that to the point where by the end of September in our draft reporting will be a condition, but that really does require more time in probably from committee members and being willing to meet offline. They're recognizing that we were in the early parts of summer and maybe some of the family vacations have been taken. I think that's a challenge there. So what I'm hearing from you is hopefully not if people get to work. All right, next one.
This is Christy. Oh, go ahead, Matt.
No,
Go, Matt.
go ahead, Christy. I don't have any thoughts. I was just gonna say I'd agree to anything.
I also don't have a strong feeling. I'm slightly leaning towards no in order to actually give the subcommittees more time to work, but either one's fine with me.
That's what I was going to say. I'm feeling a lack of time for subcommittee work. So if it's a trade-off there, it might be better to allow the time for subcommittee progress.
Well, that is, of course, kind of the trade-off. Will?
Kind of agree. I mean, if we could have the meeting late September, maybe. If it's receiving school, but yeah, committees need to have time.
And what's the date of the October? It's the date of the October meeting is what exactly? 12th. We have 8 days from the 12th to finalize it. So,
I do think a meeting in September could be good, but maybe it could be, we have a goal of pushing hard for August, getting done what we need to get done, and then have something that's a little bit more abbreviated if that's possible, like 2 hours by Zoom or 3 hours by Zoom for that kind of, doesn't there's extra that's needed. I don't know if that's possible with you.
No, you can't do an all Zoom meeting back when keep rules as they are.
Okay.
I have an alternate suggestion I'm going to make. Don?
Sorry.
But I could go either way. I mean, I also agree completely with this limited time. The subcommittees need time to work.
What I'm going to suggest is that we not do a September meeting, but that there's a informal meeting in September of a lead from each group. And we all talk under quorum, but it's, so it's 6 people. We have 6 to 7 people. There's a little bit of crossover here. So we can touch base on progress here. So we're under quorum. It's informal, it's fun, and it really is a way to make sure that we're making progress. And I'll bring up my little bullwhip to make sure that we are. That would then obviate the need for a September meeting and give people more time to actually get work done. If that's acceptable to other men, I'm seeing head nodding on the screens and thumbs up. Okay, no September meeting. Okay. Our next meeting agenda really needs to focus on getting reports out from groups that haven't yet reported out. So for those of us associated with Urbanscapes, we need to organize and have that progress there. And the same with shrublands. For some folks like the Carbon Cycle Institute, shrublands fall into their rangelands, but they do have unique characteristics. Some, not all are great with that. So those two really need to step up, and I think that we have some real progress in the other areas. Some are more farm related than others. One challenge from me to all of you is we have more good ideas than we have space for. And we want to not come up with a laundry list. There are laundry lists available. They're all good laundry lists. We want to pick the top items of laundry to be washed. And I suggest that we're probably not going, I'm getting a laugh from Carrie, but I suggest we've got to be in, the single digits and preferably in the low single digits to make an impact with this. So think carefully. There is the room to have, we talked about this earlier in terms of there are high potential but yet unknown opportunities that we can include in appendices. We have the opportunity to target people to other resources, but we want to make an impact here that is something that can be rolled out and is really feasible at scale and is going to have impact with both co-benefits and carbon. So I think we have some abilities here to deliver on that. So keeping those things in mind, our location for our August meeting is not yet identified, but most people the opportunity to be in Sacramento, they're going to combine it with something else for a number. So we'll get together with you folks and come up with that location. I have been given, you know how stewardesses always say, or stewards, or the people on planes, the steward I always say, you may be familiar, but we're going to say it anyway. The folks from CNRA would like to give a reminder to everybody about their reimbursements. Can you please get those in to follow up with CARD on your reimbursements so that this is not, kind of hanging out there as we use that.
Can I make one just logistical clarification too? So we had an admin section manager who was on my team that was helping support you all in processing those with her staff. She recently took another job in the process of backfilling her. So reach out to me and to Adam. We will make sure that you have the right contacts. I just want you to know that the staffing is a little flexible. We'll have a replacement for that section manager in a month or so. We can still process you reimbursements, but just a little grace while you see different things on the process.
I think in the next meeting, I'm going to bring some cookies called Little Grace. I'm just going to pass them out. Right.
I don't know what that means if we're getting grace, but
okay. Are there any thoughts from you folks? Virginia, Adam.
Well, I did want to volunteer the Health Soils team staff if there are things you want to dig into about what the state's been up to. We're happy to offer that.
Excellent.
Additionally, I mean, you individually can call any of us if you have questions about numbers or technical questions or anything like that. So it's not like it has to be black boxes or anything. You can call us. So feel free to contact us.
Jen?
I was just gonna say the reminder about October's meeting that, you know, it's ideally the final recommendations that the committee's delivering to the state. And then if you are doing any written reports, those need to be to us by October 20th, but you may have already conveyed that to committee members.
We are going to do that.
Great.
Based on Jen's comment, I'm wondering if you might have any follow-up. Person who you mentioned this with right. Am I saying the wrong thing?
It's like,
Is that so? Thanks to a small amount of support from the state, there's going to be a support person available to help in the report finalization. Jen, you are working with.
well, then I need to connect on those details so we can talk after this.
Fundamentally, we want to be able to have a report that has some coherence and is well presented so that all of this work is not simply a list of bullets that is incorporated into a state process, but we would like to be able to have something that's compelling and coherent and reflects the kind of work that's gone into the impact there. So having somebody who could do copy editing, design, production kind of stuff. I mean, how much design is not, don't worry too much, but you know, it's coherent. It's not like, boy, that was 2 pages over here that look completely different than the 2 pages over here. Okay. All right.
Yeah, keep us posted on location. We're happy to keep hosting in this room. I think Kim has reserved this room for August, but if you all decide you want to go somewhere else, we can make that happen too. So don't feel constrained, but this is an option.
Thank you. I know I've kept us 3 minutes over time.
You're done.
Consider it to be sufficient.
I guess we do need to do general public comment. Yes, I'm sorry. You're not done.
We can do.
Oh,
No, well, on the next steps and
Okay,
Yeah.
we need to do.
it's on the agenda, so. Are there any public comments on this last?
or general public.
Put one comment in there, which is I think the VIP of the day goes to Dana's son, who's been patiently sitting.
I think that is absolutely.
I mean, that's not even not make
Well, thank you, everybody online, and thank you, everybody here. We are drawing this meeting to a close.